Business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 58. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Kyler Cheatham. Kyler, welcome back to the show, as always.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you all here today. We have a good show for you today, as always. We're excited for our guest today. Before I jump into the agenda, though, just a reminder that this is the podcast related to everything related to digital transformation, including the people, process, technology, and strategy sides of change. And you can find new episodes of this podcast every Wednesday on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, as well as all of the audio podcast platforms like Amazon, Google, and Spotify, etc. So be sure to check us out every Wednesday on those platforms, whatever platform you prefer. And today's show is going to be a good one. We've got three major segments like we always do. The first section is going to be on hot topics. We're going to cover some trends and interesting emerging concepts in the digital transformation space, including some really interesting stuff you've uncovered, Kyler, related to Levi's, the consumer product company that's using artificial intelligence, sort of a use case of how it's being used at that particular multinational organization. We're going to talk about automation in healthcare. We'll talk about some compliance issues that need to be considered as a result of digital transformation, especially if you're in a highly regulated industry. And we'll also talk about the saturation of the cloud. That's going to trigger some people listening right now, which is hopefully enough to keep those people listening to see what you have in store for us there, Kyler. And I am curious to hear what you mean about that, in particular about the saturation of cloud. And later in the show, our first guest will be Dan Aldridge from Priority Software. And he's going to be on the show with me talking about some alternatives to common ERP systems. So a lot of times organizations think of SAP and Oracle and Microsoft and some of the big enterprise technology providers, and they fail to see or consider some of the lesser known options that still might be very viable or even better fits for them as an organization. So we're going to talk about what some of those considerations are for organizations that are going through digital transformations. And we'll also just talk about general trends in the ERP software space as well. So that'll be a good conversation we'll have with another industry peer and a veteran who's been doing ERP software and enterprise technology initiatives for quite some time. And then finally, later in the show after Dan, we'll have John Reed from Diginomica on the show. And actually, we're going to play a clip that he did for his podcast, actually. He interviewed me for his podcast recently. Had some great questions about the future of digital transformation and some things to think about as you're going through digital transformation. So he wanted to interview me, and we'll play you a clip because he has a very good style, and I enjoyed that conversation, and we had a good time with that, so we thought it'd be good for the audience here to hear as well. But before we get to those guests, what are some of these hot topics you've got in mind for us, Kyler?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with our big trigger factor here, the cloud. So we recently looked at an industry survey that's from CloudBolt, which is an industry criteria for cloud and a different partner that measures just overall insights of cloud solution users. And I want to ask you kind of the main question that they found the most interesting answer to, and see what your answer is, and then we can kind of dig into what the industry is. So the question is, and then everyone too watching in the comments, I'd love to hear your answers as well to this question and see if we kind of have the same overall piece of feedback. So to what extent do you agree with the following statement? In order to realize the full value of cloud, what is needed is an overarching solution that connects all of the various platforms, tools, and clouds and provides clear visibility and governance across it. So you can pick agree, strongly agree, either disagree, or strongly disagree.
I would say strongly agree, primarily because that's the whole value proposition in my mind as far as the cloud is being able to tie together, pull together different solutions. So I went all in on one extreme, so hopefully I'm somewhere close to the real answer there. Is this a survey, by the way, or is this a series of experts that gave their opinion on this?
It was a survey. So, and it was given to a specific technical executives. These are, C-suite executives that took this survey. I would expect nothing less on, the polarity. You went strongly agree, which is 12%, which is the second highest category. Agree came in at 76%. So what is this basically saying? A lot of it is saying that the cloud has really hit a wall without the integration tools in order to make it most valuable for the business. So we looked at another question, and this is a quote: "My company struggles to achieve comprehensive visibility into cloud usage and spend across all resources, clouds, and tools." 74% agreed with that. And I wanted to kind of get your reaction to that, because we've seen this real huge shift in migrating to the cloud. But there seems to be, once you're there, a bit of a cap, or a bit of a functionality lacking. And I wondered if you could give us your reaction to that.
Yeah, I think that that's a common dynamic that we see in the industry, and I would agree with the sentiment there, in that there is sort of a limit on not the viability of the cloud, but the business value that organizations are actually realizing right now. I don't know that it's necessarily that's a permanent dynamic as far as reaching that maximum level of business value. I just think that the software vendors and the technology itself with software applications haven't yet caught up to the cloud. And so we're still sort of waiting for that to fully materialize and mature. So, for example, you look at SAP and Oracle and Microsoft and some of these larger ERP vendors that were historically on-prem. They're just taking years, which is understandable. They're taking years to replicate what it took them decades to do in the past. So it's just a matter of time, I suspect, before they catch up, and in many cases will exceed the potential business value and just overall appeal of cloud technology.
So what would you say to those organizations, Eric, that are kind of in this area in which they've migrated to the cloud, they feel as though they're getting the most usage that they possibly can out of the technology? What are some options that they could continue to grow without waiting for these additional functionalities via vendors to come into that space?
Well, I'd go back to that first question that you covered around the integration and tying together multiple platforms and tools and whatnot. I think that is what is oftentimes missing, is that organizations view cloud as sort of an application-specific decision. So in other words, I'm going to implement product A either on-premise or in the cloud. They don't necessarily think beyond that. So they make that decision to go to the cloud with one application, and they might decide that's it. They don't necessarily think about, well, if you have these other outlying on-premise technologies, maybe there's a way that you could use the cloud to pull from those different sources. You also look at developments in Internet of Things and artificial intelligence, and just different data sources and the big data that's out there residing. Cloud is a great way to sort of pull that into one centralized place to get better analytics and whatnot. So that would be my advice, is maybe look outside individual applications and look more at your whole technological landscape and ecosystem to figure out where you can get the most value out of the cloud.
So the final data point I wanted to discuss with you, Eric, is a powerful one, in my opinion, where we look at 88% of IT leaders that utilize the cloud believe that it will continue to become more expensive and less innovative without a more formalized infrastructure from vendors. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, it's a good point, because the infrastructures for a lot of the vendors are still developing, and a lot of them are less mature than than one would expect. So I think that's a good point and worth noting.
Absolutely. And that kind of takes me to the transition of the conversation of talking about regulatory compliance and digital transformation. It's been an interesting last couple of years for obvious reasons, right? But specifically for organizations that live in a very compliance heavy technical world, when we look at data security, patient privilege. So we look at things like healthcare, financial services, or they have, a changing changing regulations such as law enforcement. So a lot of these, really influence how the data can be stored, and how essential data can be transposed between systems or accessed at user levels. So I'm wondering if you can kind of give us some best practices if you are in a very compliance heavy industry, what are some things you can do to make sure that your digital transformation doesn't hit a huge roadblock because of regulatory components?
Well, I guess it may sound like a mixed answer, but I would say, when you ask the question of, what can we do to avoid the roadblocks? I think first of all, you have to recognize that there may be roadblocks, and it may be that you have no choice but to face some sort of regulatory roadblocks. But I think the key to that is making sure that you have uh, good quality assurance and project governance around how the business processes are defined and how the technology ends up getting built to support those business processes. So if you're a highly regulated industry, you probably want to spend even more time than other organizations defining those processes and those regulatory impacts and the processes that affect your overall regulatory compliance. You'll want to spend more time doing that up front, and not only doing that as a transformation team, but also having checkpoints with your internal audit and or your external audit firms to ensure that you've got the right controls in place and you have the right processes. Oftentimes, the challenges you face, like with traceability, for example, for a food and beverage company or a pharmaceutical company, a lot of those issues that could cause regulatory issues are related to business process or misuse of the system, or we didn't configure the software properly, whatever the case may be. And so it's oftentimes stuff that could have been avoided or can be fixed relatively easily without necessarily needing to put in new technology. So we have a large multinational client based out of Europe that we're working with right now that's just starting that process of now going back and trying to remediate some of the regulatory compliance issues that they have from using multiple systems. And so that's a challenge to do it after the fact, but something they need to do just because they've grown and they've been using the same system now for many years, and they've acquired other companies, and in the process, their processes have become a little bit less predictable, and there's more variability in their processes, and that's creating some challenges keeping a pulse on the regulatory side of things. So I'd say that, during the transformation, you do want to make sure you build in those checkpoints in the governance to ensure that you have the right stakeholder involvement and buy-in in terms of assuring that you've got the right compliance in place.
Absolutely. And you bring up a great point when it comes to our global footprint. And so when you do have a global client that has different, maybe manufacturing warehouses, those types of things in different areas of the world, I assume they need to, take into consideration those local compliance or regulations as well, and consider that as a piece of their overall transformation.
Yeah, that's a great point, because your global transformation team may not have a good handle or understanding of what all the local regulations are, which is why you want to involve key stakeholders from each location that you're eventually going to roll out to. Um, Now, here's a tricky caveat I'll just throw in, not to go too far off track here, but oftentimes, there's a fine line between asking the local organizations, the local teams, as to whether or not they sign off on a certain set of requirements or business processes or design specs or whatever it is. But sometimes people will use regulatory compliance as an excuse to not change. So they'll say, well, you don't understand the Brazilian market, or you don't understand the market in the UK or whatever country, and they'll kind of use that as a smokescreen for a refusal to change. And so you do have to watch for that, and not assume that whatever anyone at a local level tells you is a regulatory issue is going to be acceptable. I mean, you sort of have to dig into that a bit. Oftentimes that's where the internal audit group can help, because usually they know what the local regulations are and what the controls are that need to be in place there. So you do want to identify those compliance issues at the local level, but you also want to dig deep to make sure you separate the ones that are real regulatory issues versus it's just more of a resistance to change issue.
Absolutely, excellent point. You want to be able to consider that across the enterprise, and that's a really good transition to my next hot topic, which looks at automation in healthcare specifically. So obviously, we know healthcare has been an industry that has gone through a lot of forced digital transformations within the last 3 years due to the global health pandemic. We've seen rise in telehealth. We've seen, remote diagnoses, different things that we typically would say was a core face-to-face environment when it comes to patient provider interactions. So we've looked at a very interesting case study that talks about the utilization of AI in healthcare specifically, and that comes because of this huge gap in healthcare workers' labor shortage, which we know has been a global issue throughout the pandemic. So a lot of it has to do with automating processes within healthcare that might have been something that wouldn't be automated. So, for example, when you go into an office, an actual system is able to use face recognition to make sure that you are who you say you are and verify your, client records that way from data privacy. The thing I wanted to talk to you about in this specific study, Eric, was this study here talked about how healthcare workers can take an offshore workforce based approach, which they've been slow to adapt because of compliance issues. Kind of a niche question, but I was really interested to hear your feedback to see as we move through more of a digital based healthcare environment. Do you think those labor shortages can fill in gaps with that offshore model that we know modern tech companies use all the time?
I think it can. I think that's something we're starting to see more of in this post-pandemic world is the realization that there's a lot of options out there geographically and, sort of reaching into labor pools that hadn't been considered before and potential outsourcing models that hadn't been considered before. So it's kind of an interesting time in the world right now because you have this obviously we're a global economy and a global country or a global world in many ways, but then you sort of balance that, or you see on the flip side, you see a lot of pushes towards more domestic focus. Either political populism, or nationalism, which seems to be emerging in some countries, as well as just the disruptions to supply chains and whatnot that's causing a lot of organizations to think about moving production back home to their homeland. So I think that's the sort of an interesting dichotomy we're in right now. Is yes, you can outsource more and rely on global resources, but on the other hand, there's another undercurrent that's going the opposite way, which is moving more stuff closer to home.
Absolutely. I mean, and that brings me to kind of my last hot topic of the day, or a case study in talking about how Levi Strauss Company, which is a global organization, utilizes AI. And I love that you brought up kind of the transition of different labor opportunities in shortage, specifically for technology, because what Levi's has done is said, you don't have to be a very hard skilled technical person to work in the technology field. And we as a fashion company believe technology is a creative force within the design environment. So what they've done is they've really leveraged AI to look at the different materials that they use, the different ways in which they can be put together, the ways they can be stored in the warehouse to optimize any sort of robotics manufacturing. They've also looked at things like user-based content design. So putting things out on like a platform such as Instagram and seeing what their actual customers want, taking that data, then consuming it in a different format and using AI to actually create those different options in the design front. So definitely a very interesting model here. So I know you're a fashionista yourself, Eric. So
Of course,
yeah,
what
yeah,
give it
right.
away?
I wanted to get your just your overall reaction to, we've seen things like fashion design and technology really become a very lucrative and creative and almost beautiful opportunity, right? And then we've also seen Levi's can now turn paintings into jackets because of their AI technologies, those color matching opportunities, and just the overall distribution and smart manufacturing. So do you think that's something that we'll kind of see move into, maybe from the hard, more technical side to more of what we would call kind of the arts industry with fashion and being able to sell, digital art online and those types of things? Do you think we'll continue to see growth in those marketplaces?
I do. I guess I was thinking you might go a different direction, or maybe just my brain took me a different direction of what you were thinking, which is I was thinking more about how technology is evolving to address the less mundane aspects of an organization. So no offense to anyone who works in finance or accounting, but just as an example, a lot of organizations struggle to deploy technologies that can just bring together their financials and the performance management and the accounting GL consolidated results aspect of things. That's just one example. And that's sort of a fundamental core back office thing that isn't a big differentiator, but it's sort of a minimum ante to be able to be in business, is you need to be able to do those things. And so I almost view it as sort of like it kind of made me think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You've got, at the base survival level is do the real simple stuff, or what should be simple, relatively simple. is like the financial and accounting stuff. And then what you're talking about where Levi's is, they've worked their way up to that self-actualization phase of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where now they're thinking about the customer and the customer experience and how that all ties back to product design and the sourcing and the supply chain and all that stuff. So they're taking, it sounds like, is a pretty broad-based look at their operations and using technology to automate some of those things. But it sounds like it's focused on the customer experience. You didn't use those exact words, and it didn't sound like they used that exact term, but that, is a buzzword that a lot of organizations will use, is that customer experience. So I think it's a good reminder that technology has a lot of potential that's being unrealized by organizations because they're having so much trouble just getting the base foundational stuff in place, like your finance and accounting. Not at all. I don't think that's really what you asked me. But
No, I think that was a great evolution of the question, because you're so right. I think it's just the overall meeting of the ability to understand how technology can optimize your business, even if you're not, say, a huge financial firm or something like that relies on very hard data. This is more within the creative process, and I think you answered that perfectly. I think it's a very interesting tie to our last hot topic in labor shortage, because what Levi has done is they've made their entire workforce technologists. And I'll read you a quote from, they actually hired a chief AI officer and strategy, so that, a new kind of C-suite position that we don't often see, especially from a fashion company, right? But he said, you can throw the best data programmers at a problem, but sometimes if you just give non-technical people the tools and language to speak about these problems and give them an understanding of what machine learning can do, there will be many more things that you can accomplish as an organization. And I just thought that was really well said, in the fact that, there is a place for maybe those more creative minds within the technology conversation. And that's how we work together as an enterprise holistically, right? You do have hard data programmers and mining and those types of bigger technical skills, but then you also have the strategists that understand how to kind of conceptualize and put those into the business to best kind of optimize the experience. So I thought those went hand in hand pretty nicely.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you on that. And that's a good segue into our next guest, who will talk further about some of the trends in the ERP software space, particularly among the lesser-known software vendors in the market. So we're excited to have Dan Aldridge on the show from Priority Software. And really the whole premise, or the whole reason I wanted to have him on the show, was to talk about how many options are out there and how viable some of these options are that are not common household names in the enterprise technology space. So, for example, SAP and Microsoft and Oracle are the three best known enterprise technologies, but those are far from the only three options available to you. So we want to talk about and explore what are some of those other options, how viable are they, what some of the pros and cons of leveraging both a big name vendor as well as a lesser known vendor. And then just in general, what are we seeing in terms of trends in the enterprise technology space? So we're going to have Dan on the show when we come back from a quick break, but first we'll take that break and we'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 58. My name is Eric Kimberling, here with Kyler Cheatham. You can find new episodes every Wednesday on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as all the usual audio podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon, etc. So be sure to check us out and subscribe to the show. I'm excited for our next guest. Dan Aldridge, who is with Priority Software, is on the show. And we're going to talk today about some of the alternatives to big, commonly known ERP systems And we're also going to talk about just general trends and evolutions in the ERP software space. And really the whole context for this conversation is that we wanted to bring a guest on and have a conversation about some of those lesser known technologies. What are some of the pros and cons? What are the things maybe we aren't thinking about as it relates to these technologies we may not know much about? And how can we selectively leverage those sorts of technologies if and where it makes sense within our organizations? So I thought it'd be great to have someone who also has experience with a number of second and third tier ERP systems and enterprise technologies over the years. He's worked with a lot of different technologies. Some are well-known technologies, some aren't as well-known. So he will have a unique perspective on some of those dynamics within the industry. So all that being said, Dan, welcome to the show.
Sure. Thanks a lot. So I am the Director of Pre-Sales and Sales Engineering at Priority here in North America. I live in outside Washington, D.C. in Reston, Virginia. And I came from the consulting side. I've been a consultant in ERP and business management systems for about 25, 26 years. So I date myself going all the way back to a company called Baan, B-A-A-N, that I started at. And they were sort of the Dutch SAP back in those days, mid-90s. And I worked for them. And then I built a consulting firm with that product, and my company was bought by Priority in 2016. So I came from the consulting side up until about 4 or 5 months ago now. I joined the sales team. I'd been doing a lot of demos and things like that, but I was director of consulting. So I kind of have a consultative type sale that I do, and hopefully inspires trust in companies that we're working with the sales team on.
Yeah, and I thought your background is a good reason why I wanted to have you on the live stream and on the podcast here today, is because you've worked with multiple systems that are good alternatives potentially for a lot of organizations, good alternatives to the big guys, the big SAPs, Oracles, Microsofts of the world. And so that background is certainly going to help you. You've sort of seen this mid-market space or upper mid-market market as well. And I think you have some unique perspective there. So that good. Well, thanks again for being here. Thanks for that introduction. I guess just to start the conversation here, what do you think in general, what do you see as some of the pros and cons of just migrating to one of those bigger known name brands, if you will, those household names like SAP and Oracle? What are the pros and cons of sort of going in with those options as your vendor of choice?
So obvious pros would be market awareness, lots of companies, references, and things where they're running it. They tend to be the larger enterprise guys that have been around since mid-90s or even in some cases 80s. So there's a perception, at least, that these are very stable systems that they've had a lot of successes in the past, and maybe friends and C-levels tend to favor the big enterprise systems if they're larger companies because of reputation and because of success stories. But that's sort of the pros. And then it's like they used to say about IBM, right? You can't go wrong if you go with IBM, and I think the same can be said for SAP or Oracle. But reality as it is not exactly like that. So the span of it is potentially huge. The cost is sometimes prohibitive, and you got an on-premise system that gets locked in and things like that. So the pros would be the name recognition, the lots of successes, but the cons would be also lots of instances where they ran long and they, had trouble after they went live, maybe shutting down business at a very extreme.
Right. Yeah. You remind me of one of my favorite counter phrases to the whole nobody ever get fired for hiring IBM, or, insert big company name here, Accenture, Deloitte, SAP, Oracle, whatever. The only problem with that is you may agree, I don't know if you agree with this or not, but I can name a lot of people that have been fired for picking one of those big name vendors. So
yeah, and they put it on their resume and they move to the next one, right? So your C-level.
Yeah, and it's such a incestuous industry too that once you're in a vertical, whether it's SAP or Oracle or you're working with one of the big system integrators, you tend to stay in that space, and so you tend to drink the Kool-Aid and perpetuate a lot of the same strengths and weaknesses of that solution. So I think that's a good point you bring up there.
Mhm.
Okay, so and I'd be curious too from the audience here listening with us live, what are, if you've been through an ERP evaluation or if you have experience with systems other than those big names that I've mentioned so far, what are some of the systems you've worked with or familiar with? I'd love to hear from the audience here. So maybe just drop in the chat what ERP systems are out there besides SAP and Oracle, let's just say, and Microsoft. Let's pick those three: SAP, Oracle, Microsoft. I think we all agree those are pretty well-known names. But outside of those three, who are some of the other players in the space that should be on people's radars? I'd love to hear the audience questions, and certainly we'll ask you that same question too, Dan. So before I get to your answer to that question, though, Dan, I guess just to take that previous question one step further, or sort of shift it a little bit, instead of talking about the big name vendors, the pros and cons, what about the other vendors in the market, which is, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of other vendors besides the three that we mentioned. What are some of the pros and cons of working with a potentially lesser known, but still potentially viable product?
Well, the pros are that, it may be a case of just name recognition is not there, and a really, really good system you just haven't heard of them. I mean, for example, Priority is an Israeli-based company. We have offices all over the world and customers all over the world. But in Israel, we're essentially the SAP of Israel, if you want to say. Everybody knows us. We are the majority of the market there, it's a really good software package. We're all cloud. We do have the on-premise capability. So, but we're mostly cloud, and we're heavily cloud. So we have global implementations that we want to do on AWS and implement everywhere. So with a company with a global footprint that's not the huge, and they can't afford the huge vendors, it's a really good option. Very well priced. Like I said, heavily cloud, and that's the way the market's going. Really nice capabilities in the areas of workflow. So I think the ones that are cloud vendors, a lot of times the workflow is easy to use. It's very low code, no code type of arrangement, where you don't have to program like some of the big ones. You have to program those kinds of workflows and things like that. So those can be some really good advantages. And a huge thing is just time to implement. We're talking 2-3 months in some cases with a small to medium sized business on a good ERP cloud package. So if you're dealing with it, because it comes up on the cloud, the versions are upgraded, customizations come along with it. It's quite easy to implement, and it's easy to use too. I mean, a lot of the bigger ones are complicated and, busy screens and all kinds of things like that. So it's easier for user adoption. And you talk a lot about this, and you're absolutely right. In change management is a lot easier with a smaller package, maybe a lesser known package, but a really good solid one. And I think if they're running on AWS, for instance, that's the way we run, Microsoft backbone, and you don't have to maintain any of the databases or anything like that. You don't have to have a big IT staff. And a lot of the users can configure things like reports and workflows and things like that. Simple to use workflow tool is a huge thing. And a lot of the lesser known ones will have that.
Yeah. And that flexibility, ease of use, change management, all that stuff. I mean, those are really good points that I agree with you on that. So given that there are these other options in the market that maybe they're lesser known, but they still are viable, and they have strengths in many cases that some of the other bigger ERP systems don't have, why is it that so many organizations get enamored by the big names? Is it as simple as what you said before, which is no one ever got fired for implementing A, B, or C, or is there more to it? Or would you add to that list of why organizations become sort of blindly drawn to those systems?
Yeah, I think it's references, and they know of other companies that have implemented it, and so they feel more secure in that. But it's not necessarily the case. But I think that our main issue, or the main issue of a lot of the sort of second tier down, is that brand awareness.
Mm.
Simply, we've been around since 1986, and dominate the market over there. And there's a lot of other, companies also second tier that are like that, that are just unknown, because it's a big deal to have a massive marketing machine, and have Gartner and, people like that behind you in that upper quadrant. It stays pretty stable, as it's SAP, Oracle, Microsoft are all in that top right magic quadrant. And then, maybe the second tier doesn't get the same sort of consideration from the big. And when you're dealing with Gartner, you're dealing with larger companies that they are only kind of looking at that upper quadrant, right? So they're not necessarily looking at the ones that are even just slightly down. So it's kind of reputation. It's kind of what the analyst firms like the Gartner say about it. And it's just safe, or
Right.
It's perceived as safe, which is kind of interesting, because if the time to implement is so huge, as the things that will dictate whether it's a failure or a success is the time to implement. The cost can be staggering. And, if you're implementing it in a sort of a modular way, instead of some of the lesser known ones that have the whole footprint, including e-commerce and ERP and MES and all the things that link to it through APIs, it's a much more, it's not a modular approach that some of the big ones take, right? So you might implement purchasing and accounts payable, right? But the other pieces are not there yet. So they're doing it in phases, and it takes a long time and a lot of consulting resources. You're usually dealing with a partner, whereas, some of the smaller ones, they do their own implementations, that they do their own product development, and you get a much more personal experience, if you will. And you get care. We're not, for instance, we're not taking people in the US. We're dealing mostly with our own implementations, with our own team. We have some very good partners, some big partners, and some small that can do implementations. But in general, we're not taking it and putting it off to a VAR and saying, put it over there and forget it. So,
Right.
and I think it's not just us, but it's some of the lesser known ones that really have to prove themselves. They have to have a personal touch. They have to have support that, is very responsive and things like that, and not pushed off to a VAR,
Right. So in your career then, what was it that drew you personally to these non-household name products? Not that they're, a lot of people have heard of Priority Software and Infor and some of the other systems you've worked with over the years. But what was it that drew you personally to the let's call it the smaller, not small, but smaller software vendors?
Yeah, so it just kind of transpired that way. When I joined Bond, I was recruited. I got an MBA, and I was recruited right out of school, essentially. And I had a finance background, and I was recruited by Bond. Bond was sort of new in the US, and they were sort of the Dutch SAP, if you will. So they were very exciting. They were growing really fast. They just landed Boeing. We had Carrier. We had all these sort of enterprise level manufacturing companies. And so I wanted to join the up and coming one. They used Jan Bond, who's the founder. He always used to say, "We're number 2, but we're the best."
Right.
And I wanted to join the up and coming one. And it just so happened that one was the one. And also I'm fascinated, and I have been for, 25 years that I've been doing this. I love manufacturing. So I was drawn to their kinds of clients, and I got to visit many large enterprise customers at that time. And first thing I would do is go to the shop floor. So I was a finance guy, so I did cost accounting and everything. And they'd say, go up to the finance office. And I'd say, no, I want to go down on the floor and see how you build this thing, because I was just fascinated with it. And then I kind of fell in love with both ERP, which I still do today, and manufacturing companies in particular. So that's how I got into it. And then so it just so happened that Infor bought Infor Global Solutions, which is kind of like that next, just right underneath Enterprise, and it's in your Battle of the Titans back when you were I think you still do that. Battle of the Titans, yeah. So it's like number 4, right? So they bought Bond, and they have a product called Infor LN, which is strictly manufacturing, strictly enterprise level, pretty much. And I developed a consulting firm in that, and I grew a consulting firm, and I just loved everything about it. So again, they were this next tier down. And then finally, when Priority bought my consulting business in 2016, I get my dates messed up.
Couple decades off there.
Yeah, 2016, I had the opportunity to build another one, here in the US. And that was a very exciting, having built a couple businesses and done exits before. It was a very exciting proposition. And I saw Priority as this kind of like the Bond, it's the next one up and coming, a lot of investment recently. And that was very exciting to me.
Right. Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back from a break, we are going to continue the conversation and continue with some of the questions that we've got for Dan here, talking about some of the common alternatives to the big ERP software vendors. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology-agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 58. You can find new episodes every Wednesday on all the social media and audio podcast platforms. Thanks for listening today. We're in the middle of a conversation with Dan Aldridge talking about ERP vendors and some of the alternatives to the common ERP vendors. Yeah, very cool. And you just reminded me as you were talking through that response that, and I hadn't thought of this until you and I were talking just right now, but Bond was at some point, a larger player or a larger force in the industry than it is now. And it's just a good reminder that who we consider the big names, the big household names, or the big vendors, that changes over time too. You don't know who the next up and coming software vendor is going to be. You don't know which ones of the big guys are going to fall out of favor. I think there's an assumption that, if you're a big household name, you're going to be around and viable for the long term. But, we've seen it in technology especially, but even other industries as well. You see that who's big today may not be tomorrow, and who's not big today could be. So it's an important reminder just to not worry too much about that. Market presence certainly is important, but what's really important is just the level of fit that the technology has or doesn't have with your organization.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. I mean, the reputation is the reputation, right? I mean, there's marketing machines and there's great salespeople, and but there's you have to struggle maybe at the second tier there to get into sales cycles, to get into short lists and things like that. And you working with companies that are you're more enterprise level, but you're getting into the small and medium sized businesses as well. And if you keep an open mind, which you do, in evaluating these companies, you can find a really good fit for a company, that's less expensive and very forward-looking technology-wise, and also easy to implement and lower cost. And with the cloud, you got so many opportunities to just to do a global footprint, support a global growing business. That's also very important because these larger companies they'll have different ERPs, right? So different ERPs, different versions, different people running it, and the prospect of a company that's a second tier company that has a really good platform, a cloud platform, primarily, is that you can do a global business all on the same software, and you can use some strategies. And I was going to mention a couple strategies a little bit later on, but there's some strategies you can use to, in the interim, kind of get as many as you can up to the cloud, and that becomes sort of the backbone of your digital transformation. But at the same time, give yourself some time to adjust if you have on-premise, because I know this is something that comes up for you a lot. And I've heard you say that the cloud isn't necessarily right for everybody, or at least not right away. And there are procedures to do lift and shift and things like that, which are really good ones to consider long term. But you want something that is kind of unite the systems as much as possible, and maybe get some analytics on top in the interim. So while you're building a cloud platform with maybe a second tier company, that in the meantime you can just sort of gradually do it, like in phases, right? Bring online a website with e-commerce, bring online Amazon, things like that. They can be done in a phased approach, but you don't have to worry in the meantime of all these different versions and different brands, and it's very difficult to support a global business if you have that kind of siloed thing going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing you mentioned just a couple minutes ago about the name recognition, and you had mentioned earlier when we were talking, you talked about Gartner's Magic Quadrant, and there's a lot of CIOs and executive level people that will look at those Magic Quadrants from Gartner and reports from Forrester and whatnot, and base a lot of their decision or use that as a big input. But I think one thing that organizations need to do is remember that just because someone's on the top right quadrant of the Magic Quadrant of Gartner's Magic Quadrant doesn't necessarily mean those products are better. It may mean that there's a certain amount of money that was paid to commission that study that was paid for by the softwares. And so you have to look at the game that's being played behind the scenes. So, the industry analysts reports, I don't want to say ignore them, but you do have to take those with a grain of salt, because they're oftentimes funded by the same software vendors that are showing up in the top right corner of the Magic Quadrant. And so you have to, just because someone's not in the Magic Quadrant or not in the top right quadrant doesn't mean it's not going to be a good fit for your organization, and vice versa.
Yeah, and also the big SIs, obviously they're biased towards the large enterprise software, because that's their business. They're in the business of the Accentures and the Deloittes, like you mentioned. They're in the business of enterprise software, and they have practices in each of those, the SAPs, the Oracles, and sometimes the Microsoft, but certainly those top two. And what they're going to recommend pretty much. And if you see, and you see other ratings agencies, I mean, we've been working with G2, for instance, that are more, kind of newer and focused on reviews and social media mentions and things like that. And we've been moving up into that sort of their upper right quadrant, which is called high performers. So that's driven by reviews. I mean, in a next tier down system, your customers, if they love you and they love the consulting job that was done, you can move up in the ranks of G2. It's not a pay for play in that sense. It's more driven. It's more driven by reviews and social media and things like that, and the experiences that users have. We have a very passionate base, so you'll also hear, if you talk to our customers, you'll hear that the consulting job, that was a big factor. And the people that we're working with, they trusted. And they were, if they're not big SIs or VARs that don't really have too much of a connection to the software company itself, then you might have a more distant experience. It's a good experience to deal with the software company itself, and to have good consultants like the A-team consultants without, pushing it completely off the VARs.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. And it's a good reminder too, that there's just a lot of different variables you have to look at, when you're considering whether or not someone's in the top quadrant or, a top ranking. Is that the right criteria that's most relevant to your organization too? That's the other factor you have to look
Yeah,
at as
it's
well.
very important.
Yeah. So when organizations are considering the big options, the smaller options, and everything in between, what are some of the key criteria that you think organizations should be using to define what the best fit technology or technologies are for an organization?
So I think cloud is a huge part. The ability to customize without in a very low code, no code type manner, and to have those a cloud platform that you can bring along the versions, but still hold on to the customizations you've done, and very highly configurable. So in terms of screens, in terms of workflows, a business process management type tool that's behind it is a huge thing without programming, because some of the ones would have workflow with programming required. And also the consulting that goes with it, the quality and the ability to have a really good consulting team is a huge thing. And the ability to connect. I mean, these days, the ability to connect via APIs and have standard connections with different things as part of an overall digital transformation is very important too. So it has to be highly connected or connectable via CRM systems, e-commerce, MES, like I was mentioning, so that they have that kind of footprint and can be connected and also configured in a very nice way. I mean, you mentioned that Microsoft Dynamics, I noticed you switched the positions there, Microsoft and NetSuite, and the primary reason being it's very customizable. Now that's also dangerous in the sense that, if you can customize it so much, then you go down a rabbit hole, or you develop a vertical that gets left behind, or you're dealing with a VAR that only does that vertical. So you need it to be configurable, customizable, very good workflow, very good connectivity, and also there was one other thing I was going to mention. I'll think of it in a second, but those are kind of the criteria there, right. I would say.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. There's a lot of different criteria that organizations should be considering, and one of the things you made me realize too is we're talking, or as you were talking about some of the things to consider, is that a lot of times organizations focus on what the software or the technology can do and where the right fit is with the organization. But for any given product, even if it's the product you end up choosing for your organization, I found that it's equally helpful, in my opinion, to also understand what the weaknesses are. Not because you want to doubt your decision, or not because you want to create doubt within the organization, but because you have to know what those weaknesses are, or what the deficiencies are. And you gave a good example with Microsoft. Microsoft generally, or let me back up. I'm sure Microsoft would say that's a strength, is their flexibility, of course. But many organizations view that as a strength too, the flexibility of the product. But what they don't think about is, well, that flexibility is good because it gives us a certain amount of leeway in terms of how we can set up our workflows and configure the software. Mm-hmm. But it can also get you into a lot of trouble, like you mentioned. So you do have to recognize that for every strength, there's usually some sort of weakness that goes along with that. And you do have to understand that, because those are the risks that you've got to manage. And so in the case of Microsoft, just to pick on that example, since you brought it up, if that is the route you take, then let's look at those downside risks of what you're about to jump into, because that's where budgets tend to overrun. That's where projects get delayed. That's where just general risk comes into play. So I guess that's another point of consideration too, is if you have any sort of option where you feel like there's just all strengths and no weaknesses and it's a silver bullet, then chances are you're just not fully understanding what the pros and cons are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would add to that to say there are certain things like you mentioned in NetSuite, the fact that they have suite success. So these are pre-configured business models that may be useful, but if they're not, customizable or configurable, they kind of can be a restriction, actually can be kind of rigid. And the workflows that go with it, dashboards and things like that are, out of the box, great, but the methodology of implementing using a relatively rigid business model, if you're not able to adapt to the business rather than the other way around, then that can be a downside, so you've mentioned that before, and you're very right that selling a business model is great to get you started. But what happens is you're dealing with a business. Every business is different, except for finance, which I think they're pretty much all the same, right? But operationally, everybody is a bit different, right? And so if you have a very rigid business model that you're trying to force people into, then that can be limiting, let's say.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you on that. What about just sort of a little bit more forward looking here? And you and I have been around for a while to see sort of the ups and downs and the evolutions of the industry. Where do you see the ERP software industry headed in the future? I know you may have touched on a few of these a few minutes ago, but maybe we could build on those or add to anything you'd suggest are some of the trends within the ERP software market right now.
Sure. So the biggest thing I think with the new generation, and I'm an old dog trying to learn new tricks, but the new generation is completely mobile. Almost everything they do is mobile. And with factories and things, I'm dealing just mostly with the manufacturing vertical. When you get there, I mean, everything is robotics. It's replacing people. People are retiring, and then the industry in general is suffering from, guys retiring, and it had been, sort of a male-dominated, older type industry, and they need to be more inclusive, I think, of women and minorities and things like that, and try to recruit. But it also means that the ERP software itself has to be very easy to learn. It has to be very easy to configure, and it has to be mobile, and it has to be you have to have the ability to configure. I'll call it configure, with things like barcoding, with mobile scanners, with the WMS, guiding them with picking and packing, for instance, automating those processes, automating with machines, with an MES, for example, connecting those things, and allow people to not focus so much on learning a big ERP system, but something smaller that can be learned easily, and it's almost completely mobile. I see, and the artificial intelligence also, being able to enter things faster. You don't have as many people. You don't necessarily want to develop these kind of late stage learning on something, or having old skills. For the millennials and everything's online. They want to just take their phone and they want to scan it into a mobile app and upload things to the system through a mobile app. They want to be able to scan to receive something, and so on. So it has to be very highly automated, and you'll see that they also need to be connected to e-commerce systems. So as people move away from retail stores, for instance, and they move to Amazon, so they got Seller Central, and they want to make a connection with that. So software has to be able to do that very easily. So those are some of the trends that I think are coming. Got to get those young people into this, get them learning ERP software, get them learning it in high school, or maybe even, I don't know, it definitely in high school and college to have programs like that. And it's kind of like manufacturing in general, right? The same trend you're seeing is a trend to much more automation, much less people driven, and learning, like apprenticeships, for example. I've been in some of these kind of manufacturing 4.0 type conferences where they talk about advances in manufacturing, but at the same time, the people that work in the factory are not, they're not doing manual labor anymore, right? They're doing things like they need to maintain the robots. They need to program an ERP system or configure an ERP system. So those are different skills,
Right.
So traditionally, guys like me, I learned an ERP software of the past, and I want to have a business management system of the future, and I want to bring along millennials, with me, and minorities with me. It's a huge thing, minorities and women leadership in this area, and getting them to learn. It's like the STEM, in a way. We need women engineers, for instance. We need people that learn it early, and we need to expand the labor pool, and we need to start earlier because we're retiring. I mean, I'm not too far from retirement myself, so I need the next generation to come behind me, and they're going to come with their cell phones and their iPads, and that's what they're going to bring to the table.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back from a break, we are going to continue the conversation and continue with some of the questions that we've got for Dan here, talking about some of the common alternatives to the big ERP software vendors. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 58. You can find new episodes every Wednesday on all the social media and audio podcast platforms. Thanks for listening today. We're in the middle of a conversation with Dan Aldridge talking about ERP vendors and some of the alternatives to the common ERP vendors. Well, you bring up a good point too, that diversity that you're seeing a lot of the world, a lot of cultures throughout the world that are promoting and sort of trying to advance that view of diversity within organizations in general. You're seeing that same push in technology. And I have to wonder, and I never thought of this until you were saying it, but I have to wonder if that might help our industry become a little bit, not only diverse in terms of creating opportunities for more people to get involved in the technology space, but also to maybe bring in some fresh thinking to where we're not myopically doing the same things we've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years that has led to the same dismal results for these sorts of implementations. So maybe having some diversity and some additional brains and different ways of thinking will help us get there. I don't know. That's just more of a question than anything.
Yeah, and also for example, in Africa, you guys are in Africa, and I think that's wonderful because it's an emerging market. They're hungry for it. They've been underserved from a technology point of view. And you need things like we have a offline capability to upload orders or to work offline, and then when they get an internet connection, they can sync it up to the ERP. So in Africa, I mean, everybody has a cell phone, and they have cell towers, but they don't necessarily have widely used internet. So you're not going to be all the time connected to a cloud system, right? So you might have
Right.
to enter something offline. But I think the most exciting part of you guys being there, you can start a generation of Africans that want to get involved early, and we can have training programs and apprenticeships and all kinds of things like that. Because in manufacturing there, for instance, when they start it right and start it with new technology, but they also have to have connectivity is a huge part of developing countries, and how they consume technology.
Right. Even more mobile in many cases than here, where you are in the US or here in Europe where I'm at. I mean, it's a lot of times those cultures and economies are built more on mobile devices, even more so than the rest of the world. So that's back to your earlier point about mobility being a future trend. I agree with you largely for that reason. Here's a question or more of a comment, I guess I'd say, that I'd maybe see what your thoughts are here. And this is from Shikar on YouTube. Makes a comment, near future likely to be light, agile, modular, and customizable. What are your thoughts there? Do you think that's where ERP software is headed? Do you see exceptions to that, or what are your thoughts?
All of the above.
Yeah.
All of the above. That's where it's headed, and it has to be that.
What about, so let me just play a devil's advocate though. What about a large organization, a Fortune 500 organization, the ones that we're maybe alluding to without mentioning them by name, or maybe I was alluding to them without mentioning them by name, the ones that are more likely to go with an SAP or Oracle, or one of the big names. What about those cases where they're trying to scale, or they're trying to create more of a common operating model, or they're driving cost out of the organization? Do you still see this being true in those cases, or do you see them being more drawn to that, call it the more monolithic way of the historic monolithic way of implementing technology?
I think they can still be drawn to the right way to do it. I mean, the old monolithic way is not sustainable. At least that's my opinion. I mean, you have to move, I think, eventually to a cloud platform. People are not going to have these huge IT groups and things like that, and the needing to upgrade the database and all of these things. And they want to be connected to the cloud through, just a connection, an internet connection with a browser, as opposed to a VPN, logging into various on-premise systems that are disconnected. I just don't think it's a sustainable model, ultimately. And also the education plays into that as well, because who's learning, as I shouldn't mention any particular ones, but who's learning the huge enterprise software packages, and who's learning even how to use them.
Right.
Yeah, I just simply think it's not sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And we've sort of exposed over the years, we've exposed the weaknesses and the limitations of that model. I think it had its place in history, or its place, in helping organizations scale at one point. But now I think even in cases where you do have an organization that's trying to scale up for growth, and they're trying to create a certain amount of commonality across the operations, I think there's still a really important role for flexible solutions in that. Even if you're trying to create a common operating model, chances are you may want to do that common operating model a little bit differently than the way your peers are, because you're trying to be different. You're trying to create a competitive or whatever. And in that case, you need that flexibility. And I could see a lot of these systems moving more towards what I think you were alluding to earlier in the conversation, moving towards more of a platform focused approach versus these are the specific workflows, or this is how the software works. It's sort of creating more of an open architecture and creating more opportunities to create, an app store or third-party bolt-ons or whatever it is that gives you more flexibility in that way too. So I think maybe that's just a different way of thinking, or ways we need to think about software a little bit differently going forward.
Yeah, I mean, as long as it can handle growth, it can handle. I've seen thousands of users on a second tier. For example, I think you're probably familiar with a company called Flex, which used to be Flextronics. It's the second biggest, component manufacturer in the world. They run Infor-LN, but they were on Bond, and now they run Infor-LN, pretty much through the ecosystem. But we found that there were a lot of, when I came over to Israel, I started, the first thing I did was I came over to Israel and I said, can I get a look at, some of your customers? Can we visit some of your customers? And they said, yeah, we've got this company Flex. And I was like, because I had finished an implementation with my old company at Flex, putting in their financials and their global finance model, including shared services, but that was on N4LN. So I knew that was the global path. And I said, they said, well, they run priority here. So we went over to the plant and they told the story of, hey, this is a highly configurable system. I hadn't seen it really in practice yet. So they said, this is very highly configurable. So we tried to go to the other system, more monolithic system, and then they switched back because of the configurability, because of the workflow, a lot of the things that the other system didn't have, or they were very difficult to learn. I mean, they just like something was easy to learn, and it turns out it was scalable because they have thousands of users. And I said, wow, it's on AWS. It's they're just running Chrome browser there, and they can just connect up, and it's fast and it's configurable and easy to learn, relatively, versus a monolithic one. And they just chose to do that. So as long as, I guess my point is that as long as it's scalable, and a second tier system can be very scalable. It's not just necessarily small and medium sized businesses. So you want something that is scalable, that is on the cloud, that does allow a global footprint. That's very important too. Multi-site, multi-currency, multi-company, intercompany transactions, consolidated financials, all of these things can be had with a second tier system.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And here's a question from Third Stage Consulting Group. I know them, by the way. But this is from our team at Third Stage, is asking the question: if young people are interested in this field of ERP software and digital transformation, what are some steps they can take to establish a career in the space?
That would be a you question, wouldn't it?
Yeah, actually, now that you say that, that is something our team would do, is they would try to put me on the spot and ask me instead of our guest. And Kyler, who's our marketing person, who's also the co-host of my podcast, tends to put me on the spot a lot. So yeah, I could take a shot at and see I'd be curious to see what you think, though, Dan. But I'd say that, first of all, the more you can learn, if you're still in school, the more you can learn about supply chain and operations, I think the better. That's a really good foundation, is just to understand business and understand how processes work within organizations. And it doesn't have to be supply chain, by the way. It doesn't have to be manufacturing, like you and I both have backgrounds in manufacturing, but it could be finance or accounting, or just understand business. I think that's a core fundamental thing. And if you can get an internship at a technology company or with a consulting firm just to learn the ropes a bit, I think that helps quite a bit. But I guess my main advice to anyone that wants to go into digital transformation, either as a college grad or as someone who's just mid-career or some point in their career and they want to switch to consulting, I'd say just learn as much as you can about both sides of transformation, the digital and the business part of it. Because I think if you can do both, that's almost a prerequisite or a must-have to be good at consulting. But the problem is a lot of consultants tend to focus on one or the other. They know business really well, but not technology, or vice versa. What are your thoughts, though? What do you think it takes for a younger person or someone who's trying to switch careers? How do you get into this space?
Well, I think that you need to get it early, in schools and universities and things like that. And so the business learning, the concepts behind things like finance, for example, having that earlier, and then getting the basic conceptual training, if you will, focusing on that. And then I think it's incumbent on, organizations such as yours to develop programs that people can take earlier. So, start getting into even high school. was talking to Kyler. She said the Lockheed Martin guy last week was talking about elementary schools. They're going back into elementary schools, and these kids, you got to give them credit for being really smart, and they're very tech savvy, right? They use the mobile devices. I see them flying around on those things. I'm like, wow. And, they're learning Excel and Word, and, they're learning all the sort of backbone technology that you need to at a very early age. So I think you can layer in the digital transformation tools, right? So the ERP, the data science, the analytics, all of those things at a relatively early age. I could see it. I'd love to teach a high school class in ERP software. I think it'd be wonderful. Just go to and maybe that's what I'll do in my next life.
Yeah, like a lot of people do, and that's having that sort of experience and being able to take it back to the college, the future workforce within college, I think is a great idea. And it was interesting for those that aren't familiar with the Lockheed Martin guest, it's last week's podcast. We had a guest who is the head of workforce planning and analytics, and we talked a lot about how they're building their workforce, how they manage the workforce in general, but also in a post-pandemic world, talking about the Great Resignation and all the turmoil in the marketplace right now. So check that out on my Transformation Ground Control podcast that was out last week. You can find that interview. I believe it's episode number 56, if I remember correctly. But don't quote me on that because my memory is terrible when it comes to stuff like that. And it was interesting though to hear him talk about how they're looking at sixth grade on as sort of proactively developing that workforce and the skills that are needed to be successful in the future, but also so they have a work pool that's capable. I think it's pretty smart thinking, but you have to have that long-term mindset to be able to think ahead like that. And I think that's something that, our industry that you and I are in could learn a lot from that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back from a break, we are going to continue the conversation and continue with some of the questions that we've got for Dan here, talking about some of the common alternatives to the big ERP software vendors. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. Hi, this is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we recently hosted our Digital Stratosphere 2022 virtual event. It's 3 days of packed content related to digital transformation best practices, about 16 or 18 different workshops and different speakers that are presenting on different topics, everything you need to know about transformation. The bad news is if you miss that event, the event's over. The live event already happened. But the good news, if you've missed it, or even if you did attend it and you want to see replays or you want to catch the sessions you missed, you can do that now by going to stratosphere2022.com. Go to stratosphere2022.com, register. All you have to do is put in your name and email address, just a few fields. You get immediate access to all the recordings, and the recordings cover everything from digital strategy, software selection, organizational change, process improvement, architecture, data migration, cloud, trends in the industry, how to avoid failure, some of the legal aspects to think about, contractual aspects to think about as it relates to your transformation. All that is stuff that you'll get by registering for Stratosphere 2022 replay. And again, go to stratosphere2022.com and you can listen to all the replays of all the workshops that you might have missed at the event. So hope you check it out, and thanks for listening. We'll see you soon. Bad to the bone. Hello and welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 58. You can find new episodes every Wednesday on all the social media and audio podcast platforms. Thanks for listening today. We're in the middle of a conversation with Dan Aldridge talking about ERP vendors and some of the alternatives to the common ERP vendors. There was another question here that I wanted to ask here, or have you answer maybe here, is again from Third Stage Consulting Group. Would you say that the cloud or more open source system would require more internal IT support? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I tend to have a controversial opinion on this, or either that, or it's just there's no clear-cut consensus in the industry on this topic. But maybe just, in the context of managing a more flexible product that's either cloud or open source or any sort of technology that, low code is another one where you, back to your Microsoft example before, where it's like you have the tool sets and the abilities to change the software. Does that create a need for more IT support, to be able to manage stuff, or what are your...
No, just the opposite.
Okay.
Because you're not, with an on-premise system, you're maintaining everything, right? You're maintaining database, for example, your networking, customization, code. All of those things are being handled by an internal IT staff, and in a company of some size, it's going to be a big one. Cloud is taking a lot of that out of the picture, right? And it's all getting upgraded at the same time, and as long as it's multi-tenant and you're able to connect to that, and you're able to bring along customizations, for instance, and put the power in the hands of the end users, the key users and the end users, right? If you have a workflow tools, great example, to set up a workflow in a good workflow system in a business process management takes seconds. There's no programming involved in it. You say, here's a status, and when it moves through this status, send an email, send a text. These are very easy things to set up. So it reduces the IT staff. It can reduce it significantly, or better yet, keep some IT staff, but retrain them on things that are much more value add, rather than coming around and installing somebody's laptop.
Right.
You got Microsoft 365 for that. You don't need to have somebody come around and install stuff on people's laptop. What you want is to get the information out of these various systems and train people on more of the high value type activities, right? Aligning with the KPIs of the business, being able to see dashboards and analytics that are all along the same lines as the business needs, right? Structuring those things and putting the power of reporting, report writer, for instance, that was used to be a huge thing when I was at Bond, for instance. Most of the customizations were just reports, right? You had to write code to get a new report. So if you wanted to add a field or something like that, that's a whole new program. And I would go into a company like Flex, you can imagine, they had hundreds and hundreds of customizations, and probably close to half of them were reports, because they didn't have a report generator in the hands of an end user that could do that. It had to be coded. So, right. And when you go to the next version, every one of them had to be reprogrammed, But the thing to do would be to give a powerful reporting tool some BI and some dashboard capability, which that's what we do. We embed the analytics in there, and allow an end user to configure their workflow, to configure their screens, to set up role-based home pages, things like that, with the correct flow. And if you can do that in a tool that is very intuitive, and just say, you're a buyer, you have all the purchasing things, purchase order reports, just put it on the desktop there and allow them to work with it without customization. So that should be the goal, I think, is to focus on high value add type procedures, and more of the data analytics. And that's also where I think you're going with the digital transformation, is you want, and that's also part of change management, is when you're retraining people to be, even an IT staff, you want to repurpose them away from putting software on somebody's computers to using a data, analytics tool to measure the business.
Yeah. So if anything, it just changes the skill sets and the focus of an organization, kind of moving from more of a reactive support fix type of mentality to more of a strategic mindset, which I think that's what a lot of organizations want, but repurposing or retooling, reskilling the IT department to not only change their skill sets, but also just behaviorally and culturally. How do you shift that mindset? That's a whole change management undertaking in and of itself. But I think that technology itself, like you said, is a driver for a lot of those changes that need to happen organizationally.
Yeah, I mean, it takes away the drudgery to a
Yeah.
large extent, right? I mean, we're all in huge competition now for talent. You
Mhm.
know, you don't want a drudgery job that was the last generation's job, and probably my generation's job. You want it to be interesting, and you want it to be focused on, things that drive the business and allow you to make an impact rather than, entering a purchase order. I mean, I can see the day when artificial intelligence will, you say, create a purchase order, and I go, boop, put a purchase order in there instead of you having to manually enter stuff and take stuff off of a spreadsheet or take something from email and enter a sales order. I mean, those are all kind of drudgery tasks. And if you have a much more interesting, I guess, or exciting job role, which would be something like an analytics person or a data scientist, those things are being taught in school now. And they're very high value add for a digital transformation, right? You don't want them focused on learning how to enter a PO in an ERP system.
Right. Right. Yep. Well put. So maybe just to bring this all full circle and to wrap up the conversation here, what advice would you give to organizations that are about to embark on either an ERP implementation and or a general digital transformation? What sorts of, headline advice would you give to those teams and organizations?
So I would say that they need to be prepared for a change in their business, a way to facilitate their business. They need to sort of start gathering together what are our processes now and developing, starting to think ahead of using consultants or, other resources to help design the processes, the to-be processes, and make sure that they have organizational readiness, because particularly in a small business, people have their real jobs. I like to say, you got your real job. So you need to be having the resources that can participate in an effort like that, both ERP and in general digital transformation. So you have to have the capability, and you have to look ahead and develop a team, and, get them ready for the effort and have the C levels behind it, because if it's not just that you have to do it, if it's the shiny new thing, right? It's not that you just have to do it and get something in place. You want to make it strategic to match with the business.
Right. Yep. Yeah. You want that alignment with what you're trying to accomplish as an organization, making sure that transformation, that technology initiative supports that overarching strategy for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good. So how can people get a hold of you? What's the best way to connect with you? Is it on LinkedIn? What's your website address?
Yes, the website address is just priority-software.com.
Okay.
And my LinkedIn profile is up there.
Yes, you're very active. You might be more active than I am on LinkedIn. So you're one of my peers that likes to post about this crazy digital transformation stuff pretty often.
Yeah, I think you saw me pop up on the digital stratosphere a bunch of times, right?
Yeah.
I was in line asking questions and making comments, and so LinkedIn is a big thing for me. I'm there. I'm participating, trying to participate and add some value to conversations about lots of things, mainly manufacturing and digital transformation or ERP software. Those are kind of my big interests. But I try to pitch in on conversations. Like I saw that thing about customization, and it was just a statement, I think, just something like, you better watch out for customization or something like that. And I saw there was like 500 comments under there. And I just started getting involved in that. And I posted it on LinkedIn. I said, hey, this is a really engaging discussion about a very hot topic. I mean, customization will kill you if you don't do it right. Right. So,
Right.
That experience, you see the LinkedIn conversation. Yours are great because you have this live inline questions and things, and you had an opportunity for us, and you're answering them in line, which is phenomenal too, during that digital stratosphere, which I thought was fantastic. And I tried to get as much as I could, and then just log in and say, hey, I'm here, and I want to ask a question. And I got so many people reaching out on LinkedIn, and I was also reaching out to all the people that I saw. And you see analysts coming in there, you see, really high execs that really know this business really well. You see technology experts, you see just people that are worried about a digital transformation, or, oh my God, this is going to bring a change and I'm going to lose my job, and things like that. You had those people as well making conversations. And I was into it. I was in there pounding away with the questions and everything. But I think just on LinkedIn is a really huge thing, and to get involved in conversations, share posts, important things in the industry. I share manufacturing. I share ERP software stuff, and just be very active and connect to people. All the people that were on the digital stratosphere. I was already connected with you for years, but there was Brad Feeks, there was Kyler, there was lots of really talented people that you had on there, and I sent them a LinkedIn, or they sent me a LinkedIn. And it's just great to have these connections and have these conversations and share these conversations and reply to a post and say, hey, I have an opinion on that, right?
Yeah.
You might have some experience that might help, might help somebody else. And, I've been in the trenches for 25 odd years doing this stuff. So, some of it is just experience, and if you can lend your experience on a conversation on LinkedIn, I think it's a great thing. And I love your stream. I love your digital stratosphere. I hope we get back to the time where we can do it in person.
Yeah. Those are the best.
That would be phenomenal to go back to that.
That's our plan.
I love Colorado, so I'll see you out there.
Yep. Yeah, that's the goal and plan, is that we do that in person next time. And those that missed our Digital Stratosphere event, it was 3 days of different sessions and streams on different topics. You can go to stratosphere2022.com and you can see some of the sessions that Dan was involved with, and all the interaction and the chat that happened in parallel with the actual presentation. I thought was just as valuable, if not more valuable, than the speakers themselves. And I actually go back, and I haven't watched them all yet, but going back to watch those has been really, really interesting. So anyone can go stream it at stratosphere2022.com. But I want to thank you, Dan, for being here today. This was a really helpful conversation, and I hope that this opens the eyes to people listening, just ways to think through your options and to make sure you're not, closed off to any viable technological options that might be good fits for your organization. So hopefully we've accomplished that here today. I want to thank the audience for all the great conversation here today. Thank you, Dan, for being here. And
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to have you. And yeah, it was super fun. And we do these live streams same time every week. So we'll have our next live stream next Tuesday. And this interview it'll get edited and polished up. It'll become part of my weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which will come out. It comes out every Wednesday, but this episode with Dan on it will be a week from tomorrow. So be sure to check that out on Transformation Ground Control, which you can also watch on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, as well as all the audio podcast platforms as well, like Google, Amazon, Spotify, Pandora, all those platforms. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. Hope you all have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan. Thanks for being here today. Great conversation, and good having you on the show as a first-time guest, and hope to have you on again soon. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, Kyler and I are going to talk about some of the things we learned from that discussion and unpack some of the concepts that Dan and I talked about. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 58. My name is Eric Kimberling here with Kyler, and we just had Dan Aldridge on the show talking about some of the viable options of second tier and third tier industry niche focused software solutions in the market. What were some of your observations from that discussion, Kyler?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a big fan of Dan because he's always such an engaging participant when it comes to our virtual events and always asks great questions as well. I didn't know his background was so diverse. And I think that's what, whenever you invite a vendor on the show, I'm always like, whoa, because we typically, we typically don't talk to a ton of vendors just so we can keep our agnostic and independent advice for our audience here. But I think Dan brings a different level of that to the table because he does have, such a background in being a consultant as well. So it helps him kind of understand what clients might be looking for. I wondered if you could kind of speak to the brand awareness of these tier two systems. I think, I just wonder why a lot of times we don't hear of them as much in the mainstream conversation. And is that something that you feel like as we move towards what we just talked about in our hot topics, more of, flexible customer focused solutions, is that something that you think will change?
Yeah, well, actually, before I answer that, though, one just real quick comment on the vendor aspect or having a vendor on the show. I'm glad you said that because in the earlier segment or in the lead up to Dan, I didn't mention this, but I probably should have. Is that we are pretty serious about we try to limit the amount of vendor involvement in this show, and we carefully vet the vendor involvement to people we know. So Dan's this is only the second time we've had a software vendor on the show. The first one was the CEO of Odoo, which was back, I don't remember what episode it was, but it was a few months ago. I think it was over the summer, in the summer months of 2021. And so this is only the second time we've done it. And I always make sure that we're not going to have an overly commercial discussion because I don't want to talk about specific vendors. And he did a real nice job of not talking about his company. It's good exposure for his company to be on the show, but we didn't want it to turn into a commercial for any one vendor. And by the way, one last thing, the vendors don't pay. No one pays to be on the show. We don't make money from the show. We don't sell advertising or anything like that. And that's intentional because we want this to be educational, informative, and not biased by any commercial advertisements or sponsors or anything of that nature. So that's just a caveat. So all that being said, now I forgot what your question was. I knew that was going to happen. Maybe just summarize it or trigger it for me or jog my memory.
No worries.
It's
I
there
was
somewhere.
just I just feel like this tier two area in vendors is kind of somewhat elusive. Like we never really know who they are, and I wonder why that is,
No.
and if you think that will change.
Yep, got you. Okay, it's coming back to me now. Thank you. So I think the biggest thing is that the big vendors have reached such mass scale that they have not just huge R&D dollars that they can invest in the products, but also marketing dollars. And so it's not as much the case anymore, but I remember for a long period of time in my career, because I fly all the time in our profession, I spent a lot of time at airports, and I remember seeing a lot of ads, just billboards or banners in the airport for SAP. So business travelers that walk through an airport are going to see banners for SAP. Sometimes it's Oracle. I don't see as much Microsoft, but those two vendors in particular, SAP and Oracle, do a lot of advertising in business-centric places like that. They sponsor golf tournaments, stuff like that. So it's sort of like, it's like any niche versus mainstream sort of conflict or trade-off. A lot of these smaller vendors that specialize in one industry aren't going to spend the money to advertise in an airport, not necessarily only because they can't afford it potentially, but also because it's just wasted coverage. It's wasted marketing dollars reaching too many people that aren't their target market. So, you might be more likely to see some of those solutions in more trade journals and targeted things like that. So I think it's just a good reminder that there's companies out there that are targeting specific verticals and different functions, and then there's others that are trying to be everything to everyone, and both have their pros and cons, as we talked about with Dan.
Absolutely. And that's a great point of really just taking the evaluation process seriously when you are understanding the marketing message versus the actual needs of your organization is really key to making sure that you do consider these different vendors that might be, a better option. And then I like how we also kind of talked about a phased approach to a cloud solution or moving to a cloud solution. I think we talked a lot about at Digital Stratosphere, which you mentioned in your interview. We had, the lift and shift or the built from scratch. And this one sounded like almost a hybrid between the two of them, where you really could kind of phase your overall saturation within the cloud. And I wondered if you could kind of elaborate on kind of those hybrid options that we don't talk about a ton, but could be a good option for a business that might not be quite ready to completely, leave an on-prem solution for the cloud.
Yeah, it sort of takes me back to that opening hot topic you talked about related to usage of cloud and the integration of different solutions all within the cloud. I think that's kind of where we're at, and that's a good example of how you can leverage both on-prem with cloud solutions. As long as you're integrating data and the technologies in a way that makes sense to you, I think it's perfectly doable. And in not only is it doable, but in many cases it's a necessity because, as we talked about earlier in the show, not all software technologies have fully matured in their cloud offerings. So many organizations we work with, especially in manufacturing and especially in some of the outlying functional areas of a business like predictive analytics or product lifecycle management or some of the non-core ERP types of technologies. In those areas, you tend to see less maturity for the cloud solutions, and you end up more likely to use those as on-premise solutions. So again, this is a transitionary period, I believe, in our industry. I don't think this is going to be relevant in a certain number of years. I don't know how many years, but in a few years it won't be relevant. But I think that is kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah, and as we move to your great conversation and great audience conversation about the future of ERP, I have to ask you this because I feel as though I owe it to my peers at Third Stage when we talk about open source solutions or agile opportunities, and saying that we don't need more internal IT support. And that is something that I know a lot of our clients kind of get within this magical idea that, all of a sudden you're going to flip a switch and you don't need an IT department anymore. And that just simply isn't the case from the feedback that we get. So I wondered if you could play devil's advocate just for a minute and kind of explain why you need to consider the internal resources, and it's not a silver bullet type of solution.
Yeah, because I think at the end of the day, whether you're going to use more or less IT resources is, I don't want to say it's irrelevant because it is relevant. You do need to understand that, but I think it's even more true or more universally true that your IT department is going to be impacted in some way. It may be that you're using more or less resources or you need more or less technical resources, but regardless of whether it's more or less, you're absolutely going to see a big impact to your IT department. And we talked about some of that with Dan, where you might have to repurpose some of those resources or upskill or train them on different competencies that you don't have right now. So moving to open source sounds great, as though in some ways suggesting that you don't need an IT department or it's going to become easier. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the reality is, regardless of whether it's easier or harder to support that environment, it's a different language almost for your IT department. So they need to you need to make sure you bring along your IT group so they can support it going forward.
Absolutely. Well, such a great conversation with Dan, and this is always nice to have someone that's really involved in the Third Stage community and overall dialogue, as we'll continue to hear from him in those live streams that you can join us um, at 10 a.m. Eastern time in the United States. I highly recommend them every Tuesday morning. Great way to kind of start your day and network. And Dan also talked about our Digital Stratosphere event, which is still available. If you go to stratosphere2022.com, and you can watch the recordings and continue to network with a lot of those people. I know he talked about the LinkedIn connections that he got, and just overall building that peer network is so important. So thank you for that great conversation. I think the future of ERP is an excellent segue to talk to Jonathan, because he is. I don't even know if there could be someone that would be more of a an advocate for clients than you. But Jonathan kind of sits on that side of really just pumping through any barriers or biases within the industry as well. So excited to hear that conversation.
Yeah, he's got a good perspective and something that's very, he's unique. And he's also has a very entertaining, edgy sort of coverage of the industry, which I really like because I think our industry tends to get a little stale or stodgy. Stodgy, is that the right word?
Well, you are in Europe, so I think they say that.
That's that's true. I don't think we mentioned it at the beginning of the podcast, but yeah, I'm in Europe right now. Kyler's in the U.S. as we're recording this podcast in this virtually global world we're in. But anyway, so yeah, John's a good guest. We'll have him on next. And actually, it's kind of strange because he's kind of a guest on the show, but really, I was the guest. I was in the hot seat because he was interviewing me for his podcast. So we're actually going to play you a clip from that podcast that he actually published a few months ago. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was awesome. And he was kind enough to give us permission to sort of play the replay here in our podcast. So we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to have John Reed on the show, who's going to interview me about some of the trends and just some of the things that I see in the industry and where I see us headed in the future. We're going to take the quick break, and we'll come back with John Reed, who's with Diginomica, which is a website that is really good, actually, by the way, before I get too far into it. Diginomica.com is a great, pretty unbiased site, even though they are vendor funded. They're good at being balanced, and go to Diginomica.com. But we're going to have John Reed, who's one of the founders and key contributors to Diginomica. He'll be on the show after we take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Really excited for this next conversation coming up with Eric and Jonathan from Diginomica, and talking about just the overall influence of vendors and what different partners can have on your digital transformation. So with that, Eric, I'll turn it over to you. And really, we're turning it over to Jonathan because he is actually facilitating this conversation. So with that, we'll jump in.
How we doing, Eric?
I'm good. How are you, John? Good to be here.
Fine. This is your first time on the show, but man, you and I go back a long time in this industry. We probably shouldn't even dwell on that at the moment. We'll start to feel ancient.
A bunch of old timers talking about the old days of the industry and whatnot.
Yeah. Like back when the classic rock songs that we both like were actually being played on the radio. Like it's crazy. But anyhow, we're here to
still being played on the radio stations I listen to.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, all right. So we're going to be deconstructing digital transformation today, and basically kind of talking about why it so often, comes up short. And this is inspired by one of Eric's recent blog posts, but this is like something that you go pretty deep into. And you've prepared a couple of countdowns for us on underrated keys to digital transformation, but also keys to how digital transformation falls short. So I'm really looking forward to going through those, and I'm counting on our audience to poke us a few times during this conversation as well. But Eric, I do want to also give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your business model, because I think you're doing something kind of interesting. Because first of all, you Third Stage is an advisory and services firm, but you really are independent in the sense that you don't take any vendor money, and that's pretty rare in our industry. And I feel like that gives you an interesting opportunity to really provide customers with, like, when you say independent, it really does mean that, because you're not taking money from vendors. So,
right, yeah, and it's all of our revenue is derived from our end clients, who are the people or the organizations that are actually implementing the technology. So most ERP vendors and system integrators and VARs are getting commission or some sort of kickback from the software vendors, which is a brilliant model on the vendors' part, because you get these you people out there promoting your product because they make money off it too. And so I see why they do it. but there's no one out there representing the clients, or there wasn't anyone out there representing the client side of things. And so that's why we started the company.
The other interesting thing about Third Stage, and how long has it been around now? It feels like is it 5 years now?
Almost 4. It'll be 4 years in April.
Okay. The other really interesting thing about what you do is that if I didn't know better, I'd think you were a publishing company. I mean, you proliferate content. You do a ton of video, and you also your blog is extensive. You also have various studies and reports. I feel like you're drinking my Kool-Aid about how content and really earns the trust that is sort of the bedrock of like the modern sales and advisory. Not many people really drink the Kool-Aid that I try to serve up there, but man, it feels like you've got your own recipe for it. Like is that working for you?
It is. That's where most people learn about Third Stage, is either through our YouTube channel, one of our YouTube channels, or the blogs that we put out. We just started doing it just because, what better way to, first of all, if you back up, I just like to help organizations. I mean, at heart, I'm a consultant. That's all I've ever done. I like helping companies. And so that's sort of where it started, was really just, putting content out there that would help companies. But then we found, well, wow, this is actually turning into a lot of business for us. So let's do more of it. And so we just sort of cranked it up over the years. The other part of it too, though, is that, what better way to figure out if a consulting partner or a potential consulting partner is going to be a good fit by kind of testing them out, like listening to what they have to say, listening to how they think. And, and if you like the philosophy, great, you're going to want to work with us, and you might find that's not what we're looking for, in which case that's okay too. So it is a good way for us to connect with our intended audience, which is, very, very specific.
Yeah, we could probably have a long conversation about the content part of that and why that's so important. But it does create a lot of fodder for our discussion today, because you posted a year-end blog on what you learned from digital transformation 2021 that I'm really looking forward to getting into, because really kind of gets into why digital transformation falls short, which I think is a really, really important topic for all of us in this industry who, I'm something of an advocate for transformation. I think a lot of people like you and me are. But we are accountable for the results. Like, if we're going to advocate that, we also have to show that it's working. So exactly. that gap there, I think we do need to address. And one cool thing about our show today is, in addition to preparing some exclusive material for me, I get the chance to dig behind your blogs, because your blogs show up pretty frequently in my hits and misses best of the week. But if I ever would have a criticism of your blogs, and this is just for me personally, a lot of times I'm like, Eric stopped before he got to everything I wanted to hear from him, because you have a very concise style of blogging, which I think works well for you. And I'm probably one of those people that just likes a lot of the meaty details of things. But now I have you, so now I get to force the issue. And I've also challenged you, because I know that change management is one of your big themes on why these projects succeed or not, which I tend to agree with. But I've challenged you to be very specific about what aspect of change management we're referring to, because I think it's a really important topic, but it's also a really, really broad topic. And I want to see if we can hone in on exactly, when we use that phrase, what does it actually mean. So I got you on the hot seat a little bit, but I think you're going to do fine, because you've been living and breathing this for a long, long time. So. And
I've been watching your show, so I kind of know what to expect. I
know
I know your tricks. I know what you're going to pull on me, or I think I know. So we'll see how it goes.
Okay, cool. And also feel free to turn the tables from time to time. It's totally fair game. Maureen is asking for the name of the blog. It's Third Stage Consulting, thirdstage-consulting.com. That's for our audio listeners. I'm actually going to paste Maureen into the chat, the blog on what Eric learned from digital transformation in 2021, and then you can also derive the blog URL from that as well. So thank you, Marina. Marina, counting on a few spicy comments from you, so I'm glad you're here early. So Eric, before we get into the countdown, I actually want to get into this blog post a little bit. There's a phrase in here that I really liked, that really stood out to me. Whoop! I got to get your white paper pop up. Okay, here we go. Okay, there's some really important themes in this blog, but there's one quote that I really want to call out here, which is, "I'm still surprised each year that goes by that we as an industry haven't yet figured out how to make digital transformations more successful. I think until we figure that out, that's going to be a drag on the digital transformation space. Wow. Okay, so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's just, year end, you know how it is during the holidays. You sort of look back and reflect on, how things went, what you accomplished, what you didn't accomplish, what you want to accomplish in the next year, what you're grateful for, all that stuff. And so that's sort of the mindset that I had at that time. But, looking back, I wasn't just looking back at 2021. I was starting to think back, back to the late 90s. I started, I think, around the same time in this industry. And you kind of think of all these things that have changed technologically, and there's just all these new advancements in AI, machine learning, and composable ERP, and all this stuff that is newer. But then you look at the underlying the surface of how companies try to go through these implementations, and so much has not changed. And it's amazing to me that we're still repeating. You see it all the time in the industry. I think you see it too. You still see a lot of these same behaviors and patterns that have led to failure. They just keep getting repeated by the same organization, sometimes the same people. So it's just fascinating to me that we figured out the technological piece, but we can't seem to figure out all the other stuff, which is more important than the technology, in my opinion.
Yeah. Maureen says, amen. Still surprised we haven't figured it out. It's a total drag. Crazy.
I agree.
And Alan is talking about the paperless office.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too, Alan, because the pandemic really exposed us, right? Because we thought we were paperless. And then when we really tried to work remotely, we found out about all the different things that, oh yeah, just one piece of paper. But when you're not supposed to be in your office at all, you find out how important that one piece of paper was.
Right.
So, but Eric, you call into, I think, a hugely important point too, because like in the 90s, I started writing a newsletter called The Extended Enterprise, and I was so psyched. I was like, it's XRP now. It's not ERP anymore. And I was like 25 years early on that. But I think one of the interesting things is, like, I don't think I was wrong of this notion that we needed to be much more external in how we think about software. And I think if you and I were to hash this out, I think that's one of the things we come up with, is that accountability to external constituents like partners, supply chain partners, customers, and even employees is way more important than just an internal focused ERP project, right? But at the time, let's face it, the technology wasn't there to realize what I was talking about. Whereas now I would argue the technology is largely there. I mean, granted, some of the integrations and data silos and stuff are a challenge. But I don't think, to your point, the technology is what's holding us back anymore. And yet, there's still so much struggle on the ground. So I think, to your point, doesn't that really call attention to what we're doing wrong from either a people or process perspective? I mean, yeah, occasionally maybe some vendor oversells some software that's not a fit. But I don't think that's at the heart of the problem we're having now. Do you?
No, I don't. I do think, let me caveat that. I guess I'd say I do think that sort of like our ability to change is moving at this pace, but technology is moving at this pace. And so the gap between what technology can do and what our ability as humans and organizations to adapt to that technology, that chasm is getting bigger. So in some ways, yeah, I think it does. I think that it is partly to do with the technology in that way. Not that the technology is bad. I think that the problem is the technology is too advanced for a lot of organizations. Like, you think about artificial intelligence. We're struggling to find some like real meaty use cases of how organizations are using artificial intelligence today to operate their businesses better. We have the vision from the vendors. We know what's possible, but actually getting it in use pragmatically, it's just most organizations aren't anywhere close to being able to use it, partly because the technology is still emerging and also because their data is not good enough. And I don't want to go down an AI rabbit hole here, but I'm just giving you that as an example of how technology is there, but organizations can't seem to catch up to the technology. But to your point, all the other stuff is an even bigger issue, all the people, the human and operational sides of things.
Tracy, good to see you. Tracy Webster back in action. Agreed. Great at technology. That doesn't matter if we don't get the process and solution strategy right first. Well, Tracy, I think you've come to the right place based on the content Eric has for us today. Eric, so tell me a little bit about, have you attempted to quantify like how transformation falls short? I know you do some research type projects. Are you starting to get a sense of what these failure rates look like? Or, I mean, failure is kind of a tough word, right? Because sometimes failure is more like just underperforming projects, but
yeah. I mean, I'd say like failure, like the big massive disaster, like Hershey's or Haribo or National Grid, some of these well-known failures, That's pretty rare, to be honest. I mean, that might be 5 or 10% at the most of implementations out there, but you hear about them because they're big companies and it's a big deal when they can't ship product or whatever. I'd call it the bigger failure is the other 80% or so that are just sort of moderate failures. It's not a total unmitigated disaster, but man, they spend way too much time and money. They're losing a lot of business value that they should be getting out of the project. Whether or not you call that a failure, I guess that's up for debate, and it's very subjective. But that's the bigger risk, is that those moderate failures that you don't hear about every day.
Great conversation here with Eric and Jonathan. We're so excited to hear more. Such great insight. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Hi, this is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we recently hosted our Digital Stratosphere 2022 virtual event. It's 3 days of packed content related to digital transformation best practices, about 16 or 18 different workshops and different speakers that are presenting on different topics, everything you need to know about transformation. The bad news is if you miss that event, the event's over. The live event already happened. But the good news, if you've missed it, or even if you did attend it and you want to see replays or you want to catch the sessions you missed, you can do that now by going to stratosphere2022.com. Go to stratosphere2022.com, register. All you have to do is put in your name and email address, just a few fields. You get immediate access to all the recordings, and the recordings cover everything from digital strategy, software selection, organizational change, process improvement, architecture, data migration, cloud, trends in the industry, how to avoid failure, some of the legal aspects to think about, contractual aspects to think about as it relates to your transformation. All that is stuff that you'll get by registering for Stratosphere 2022 replay. And again, go to stratosphere2022.com and you can listen to all the replays of all the workshops that you might have missed at the event. So hope you check it out, and thanks for listening. We'll see you soon.
Relax, don't do it when you want to go to it. Relax, don't do it when you want to come. Relax.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm Kyler Cheatham. I'm here with Eric Kimberling and Jonathan Reed, and we're talking about some interviews that Eric and Jonathan did together regarding digital transformation failure and just overall bias in the industry. So we're going to jump back into their conversation.
Yeah, Tracy's actually moving into the solutions part of our conversation, which I'm going to kind of postpone a little bit, but I will read this quickly. She says the biggest piece is the appetite for change. It is the consultant's job to position opportunity and help clients think through it and push until they get that light bulb moment. Does that resonate with you, Eric?
It does. Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, Alan is pointing out collaboration, lots of tools, but very little in terms of people and process. Yeah, I think collaboration is a great example, Alan, because we're trying to, it's like these Slack channels pop up and we start using them, but we're not even sure how the data in those channels interacts with our core CRM systems and everything else. So, and then Tracy, you're all up, people. Tracy, we're glad that you feel that way. And Thomas, I'm going to be bringing up your post later. So just so you know, I'm expecting you to get ornery in the chat. So just so you know, I'm aware of your post and the light that you shed on the conversation. So, so Eric, just a little bit more on this blog post, because I think it gets to a couple other really important points. You have, you talk about forced digital transformations. Can you tell us more about, like, what is a forced digital transformation?
Yeah, so there's two layers to it. One is what I think a lot of people have been talking about over the last 2 years since the pandemic, which is a lot of organizations were forced into digitize. Man, I cannot pronounce that word to save my life.
Yeah,
they're trying to go digital. How about that?
They're
trying to create digital offerings within their organization or go through a transformation, and that was because so many office workers were forced home, and they just had, by necessity, realized that their internal systems wouldn't support that sort of flexibility and that sort of model. But the dirty, dark little secret that's another layer of forced transformation, which I know you like the controversial stuff, so let's just get right to it. But the software vendors kind of forcing their legacy on-prem customers over to the cloud. I think that's forcing a certain amount of digital transformation prematurely in some cases. We see a lot of clients where, honestly, we say to them, why are you doing this? Just because a vendor's telling you have to go to the cloud? That's a terrible idea. That's a terrible reason to do it. I mean, if you have other reasons, great, then have at it. But if you're doing this only because of your vendors telling you have to go to the cloud, that's a terrible reason to go through a transformation and go through that risk and heartache and cost and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think we're in a crossroads here in the sort of pandemic economy where, oh, we got everyone on these remote work projects, which was so important for business continuity. So we pat each other on the back. But how much do we really transform our business? How much do we really change to capitalize on the opportunities of today and protect ourselves from some of the risk? And one of the other things, as far as risk factors you go into in the post, is just how supply chains got exposed as part of this and this ongoing supply chain challenge, and then also the people challenge, which is really important. Could you comment on that? Because I thought that was interesting how you basically acknowledged, like, hey, I underestimated a little bit on how important the HR piece was. And I really like that you did that and kind of called yourself out a little bit. What was your view there?
Yeah, there's actually a few of them in that blog where it's like I sort of thought maybe this would be a thing, looking ahead in my predictions, but then you look back and it's like, wow, I was off, because I didn't realize how big of a deal it was. And in the HR side of it, I guess I didn't realize what I was not anticipating were the extreme labor shortages that so many of our clients are experiencing. You kind of thought, coming out of the pandemic, of course, supply and demand sort of gets out of whack a little bit with the labor force, and especially people getting sick and, or having to quarantine or whatever. There's things that will strain the labor market to some degree, but I didn't realize how significant that would be. So organizations that can really keep their employees sticky, keep them engaged, keep them excited, motivated, and committed to the organization. That's a rarity today, just because there's so many people quitting their jobs and moving into different industries entirely, or even just quitting their careers in general. That it's hard. There's labor shortages all over the place. I think most, if not all, of our clients are struggling with that pretty significantly, and that surprises me.
Tracy and Thomas are having a good back and forth in the chat about whether you need a consultant to drive transformation or not. And I don't want to get too sidetracked into that at the moment. But what I will say in response to this chat is I'm a strong believer that you need an unafraid truth teller as part of this process. And I don't think that's often available internally. So that's my view on that. But I think it could be internal. It's just, it requires someone who has the political courage internally in an organization to call people out and call processes out. I don't think that's always easy to do.
Yeah.
But
agreed.
So I want to continue to sort of paint the problems that we're facing into a full picture. And we're going to do that through your countdown. And then we'll move on to sort of the more hopeful part of, like, how we can kind of get things to a better place in this coming year, because that's why we're in this business, right? If we were just doing this to trash things, I don't think any of us would be employable. So,
Right.
But you prepared a countdown of your top 5 sort of keys to, like, underperforming projects or digital transformation failures, however you want to. So start us off with one of those.
Sure. I'm gonna readjust my setup here just so I can.
Yeah, and I can actually expand the screen a little bit too, give you a little more room.
Oh, great. That's perfect. Right. So how do you want me to just jump right in? Start at number 5. Countdown.
Yeah. Well, let's do one at a time, but we might bunch them up a little bit. So start with
Sure.
one, and let's see how we do.
All right. And actually, just so you know, John, you asked for some unique content, and you're getting unique content. You're actually getting a preview of a YouTube video I filmed that's coming out either next week or the week after. So this is something that hasn't been released yet, but it'll be released shortly. So you're
Excellent.
the first to see this.
Excellent.
So this is why the top 5 reasons why digital transformations come up short. And you also asked me to be specific and sort of cover things that you don't always hear about. So that's
exactly cool.
All right. So number 5, bias. So
Tell us more about that.
So it's you get bias either on the solution or the technology and or the way that solution should be deployed. And so there's product bias, and then there's strategy or implementation bias. And that latter part gets back to the thing I was just talking about how nothing's changed in some ways as far as how we implement we make the same mistakes over and over again. We defer to the technology. We assume that we don't need to define our future state because the software is going to do it for us. You make some of these fatal mistakes that were happening in the late 90s are still happening today. So that bias is a problem, and it sort of creates you sort of have this echo chamber in our industry where all the consultants are sort of doing and saying the same things over and over again, repeating the same mistakes and causing their clients to run into trouble. And then the other part of bias is the product or technology bias. I'm an SAP guy, or I'm an Oracle guy or gal, and that's just what I know. And therefore everything kind of fits in that, it has to fit in that world. And the reality is every organization is different. Every organization has different needs, and you have to sort of take the blinders off and have an open mind. So that's really what I mean there by bias.
Does that bias extend to prime vendor bias in a sense of like, in your experience with projects, like kind of falling back on like, well, they're already a prime vendor. They're the ones we always work with, so they'll be good for this project too. Do you run into that a lot?
Yeah. You get that. You get the mindset of no one ever get fired for hiring, insert big system integrator name here, whether it's Accenture, IBM, Deloitte, whoever. You get that bias too. So executives think, okay, if I hire Deloitte or Accenture, IBM, or whoever, of course it's going to succeed because and it's safe. It's a safe bet. But what we find is it's actually, in many cases, a high risk proposition to go with those same, the same players.
Are you able to broach those issues with customers? I know this is a little bit of a, like, it's communicating these things is a little delicate. How would you sort of help a customer to wrap their heads around the concept of bias? Because I could see how sitting down with a customer and saying, hey, I think your bias is getting in the way here would be an awkward way to put it. So how would you put it to a customer?
Well, you frame it in the context of trade-offs, right? There's never going to be a silver bullet, whether it's whether it's a certain type of technology or even an implementation methodology or approach. There is no one size fits all answers. And there's never a perfect answer either. No matter what you do, no matter what software you choose or the implementation timeline you put together, your overall strategy, no matter what you do, there's trade-offs there, right? And there's risk. And to think there's not going to be a risk or that you have the perfect answer, that's misleading. And so you have to, so the way we do is we frame it in the context of, you have two options here. Like, for example, you could hire Accenture. Here are the pros and cons of Accenture, or you could hire a real solid tier 2, second tier system integrator that's big enough, but not so big that you're going to get bombarded with, 50 kids out of college. Or you could go with a really small vendor that you have that's going to work really hard for you. They're going to be hungrier or scrappier because you're a bigger client, but they don't have the breadth of resources. So, you kind of work through those trade-offs and you open up their mind to, wow, first of all, A, I have options. B, no matter which option I choose, there are pros and cons. And so that's generally the way we do it. I've never come out and told a client they're biased, but you sort of, you help them come to that conclusion, like, wow, we haven't thought about these different things.
I like that view of kind of helping someone move them off of a more narrow way of thinking without kind of saying you're thinking narrowly, but just kind of being able to sort of show them what else is out there. And I tend to agree too with like specialty firms, a lot of times having this aggressive quality that is worth putting in front of customers, even if they still end up going with Accenture in the end. Really good to show them what a small, lean outfit of experts can do. Because a lot of times those are super experienced people that kind of banded together. Yeah. Bonnie, Duncan, Tinder, or this vendor is at the top of the X analyst quadrant, so they must be the right solution for us. Yeah, Bonnie, you know how to stoke things up in here. And man, we got some heavy hitters in the chat, which is great. And yeah, I think that is a big part of the problem, right, Eric, is that we're kind of, I think a lot of customers and people in general in this industry are looking for sort of the stone tablets of like, here are the documented top things, but it's not like that. It's so customer specific in the end and industry specific. Yeah,
I agree with you. And when I don't know if you know the story or not, but I'll tell real quick if you could humor me on this. But when I met my wife, she had 2 young kids, and I don't have any biological kids of my own. So we got married, and suddenly I had 2 stepsons, or 2 and 5 years old, and I had no idea what I was doing as a parent. So I read the book Love and Logic, which is about parenting and about giving kids choices and teaching them to learn about consequences and living with their consequences. And it was super helpful becoming a new stepdad and kind of coming in cold, not knowing what the hell I was doing as a parent. But I found that was super helpful in consulting too, because I don't mean this in a condescending way. But when you're dealing with executives, a lot of times you have to use that love and logic approach where like, hey, you own this decision. Like, I'm not going to I'll tell you what I think, but ultimately you're going to decide what you want to do. And by the way, here's what I think the pros and cons are and the trade-offs are. So that sort of like ownership and accountability that's the underlying thing that we're getting at with this is yeah, maybe they're biased. Maybe bias is sort of the symptom we're seeing here, but the really underlying root cause is the fact they're not taking ownership of some of these decisions. And really what we try to do is empower them to own it and be accountable.
Bonnie has a stat here, and this came up in my conversation with Bonnie Tinder, the last one. So feel free to check that on YouTube. I don't like this stat, but I'm going to be prisoner of the data, Eric. And Bonnie says that her GSI versus independent firm research, she finds no correlation between customer success and size of consulting firm. And I have a hard time letting go of like my romanticization of the small, nimble SI. So this is a tough one for me, but Bonnie, I'm honoring your data, and I feel like I have to respect the data. One thing I will say, however, is I would like to see data points on projects correlation with success with a project that also has an independent advisor that is separate from the prime, because I think that's a hugely important part of the equation. And I'll await the data on that, because regardless of the size of the firm, I want to see some independent advisors and consultants involved who are not tied to the financial revenues of the main project. So anyway, but Bonnie, really good point, and you definitely made me think there in our show. So thanks for that. Wow, we got a lot of interesting comments. I'm not going to be able to go through them all. But anyhow, some really good stuff around the experience levels of consultants. So Eric, what else you got? We've only gotten through one, so let's get through a couple more here on your list.
Yeah, so I'm hoping you like this one, but number 4 is groupthink.
Ooh, yeah.
So you get companies that the internal project teams and even their consultants are sort of they're in their 4 walls of their war room, their project team room or whatever, and they sort of just turn inward on building technology and mapping out requirements and processes and testing and all that stuff, and they lose sight of what's happening outside. Both, when I say outside, I mean outside, even internally within their own organization, and ultimately how this affects their customers and other stakeholders that are going to be affected by the project. So that, and the other thing too that goes along with groupthink, sort of like bias, is you start to hear what you want to hear and you feed off each other. Like, hey, things are great. We're right on track. We're on schedule. We're on budget. There's no risk. We have nothing in our risk log. Things must be awesome. Everything's green in our status report. And you start feeding off that, and it creates these blind spots all over the place where, you're sort of just going with the herd versus really challenging and what are we missing here? Because there's always blind spots. There's always risks. And so that groupthink, I think, could be pretty, that's number 4 on my list.
Yeah. And one thing that the audience might not know about you, Eric, is you've been an expert witness. You've seen a lot of court ERP and enterprise courtrooms where you've served as an expert witness on these troubled projects. And when I read about these projects that go awry, like terribly awry, like the ones that wind up in court, so much of what I'm struck by is how you're like, how did you get so far down this horrible path without kind of that gut check moment of, hey, we're kind of heading in the wrong direction here. And I think one of the big things for our industry is to figure out how to have these gut checks that create a sense of accountability and a more objective report card earlier on in these processes, so we don't get like 2 to 3 years, because by then you are in court, right? Because by then it's too late.
Yes. And, back to Bonnie's point about there not being a correlation between size and success rate of your SI. One thing the big SIs are really good at is they are brilliant at making you feel good about an impending train wreck. And I was part of it. I mean, I had partners I worked for when I was 25 years old, and I was like, how did you do that? How did you just convince the client that everything's fine when everything is not fine? Like, we have massive problems, but the client walks away feeling good. Like, okay, we're yellow status, we've got some challenges, but we've got a plan to address them. But meanwhile, behind the scenes, you're like, this thing's falling apart. The wheels are coming off, but yet we're doing the CYA thing where, these big SIs, if they've got millions of dollars per year at stake, they're going to do whatever they can to make you feel good and make you feel like, hey, everything's fine. And that's the other, that's sort of maybe an underlying undercurrent of some of these top 5 is that dynamic with your system integrator and not challenging them enough, which I don't want to. I'm jumping ahead to another one in my top 3.
Oh yeah, you don't want to spoil your own countdown. Yeah. And just real quick on groupthink, and we'll get to the next one. Isn't part of groupthink kind of department think too, right? Because I think a lot of these projects historically were too departmentally focused, and and they didn't think enough about different constituent groups inside of organizations that were also impacted. So that's got to be part of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. You're just viewing the world in your lens of what I need, what I want, and you're not thinking about, kind of the broader picture there.
Great conversation here with Eric and Jonathan. We're so excited to hear more. Such great insight. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Put us back on the train.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm Kyler Cheatham. I'm here with Eric Kimberling and Jonathan Reed, and we're talking about some interviews that Eric and Jonathan did together regarding digital transformation failure and just overall bias in the industry. So we're going to jump back into their conversation.
Vigorous chat. Nice job, folks. Okay, what's your next one, Eric?
So number 3 on my list is trusting the experts, and probably the qualifier should have in there is blindly trusting the experts. Excuse me. So that's kind of building on what I just said about the SIs and sort of blindly saying, okay, they tell me everything's fine, so everything's fine. Or what's just as bad is when you get organizations that say, well, they're the experts, they know the technology, I don't, so we're just going to let them handle this. That's super dangerous and unhealthy. It creates this really weird, codependent, unhealthy relationship that doesn't end well ever. I mean ever. So you have to have a certain amount of internal ownership and accountability. And even if you hire independent advisors to help you with that, you need to have someone that's looking out for you and watching the hen house, I guess you'd say. And you don't need the wolf guarding the hen house, which is usually what happens with the SIs. And so the SIs tell you what you want to hear. They're playing COIA because they've got a lot of revenue at stake, and then you don't have any ownership. You're suddenly now you're overly dependent on the consulting, on the experts, because you haven't built the competency in house. So that's something to watch for, is just blindly trusting the experts without challenging them.
Hi, Luca. Welcome to the chat. A lot of customers are outsourcing everything and losing control. This causes them to be guided by a consult. I think that's one of the huge points that you've made today. Underlying everything is this need for customers to take more ownership of their own projects, and part of it is embracing that your business and your users know more about your domain than anyone, and
right.
no one can come in and tell you that. Crawford's got an interesting comment here. Coming up short has its roots that there is no education as to expectations across the business. There's a real scarcity of different departments knowing what to expect and demand at any given point in a project, especially when it comes to moving to the cloud. I think, again, you kind of come up with this problem of that not enough ownership, right? And where the value of the consultant can be to kind of tell you what else is happening in your industry and where other companies have gone wrong. But in the end, you have to make those decisions and own those decisions, which is a little uncomfortable, right? It's in many ways, it's more comfortable to say, well, I don't blame me. I had so-and-so SI take responsibility for that, but it's like, no.
Yeah, that doesn't work long-term. I mean, someone has to be accountable. But to your point about, how these big failures get to the lawsuit phase and you read about it and you're like, how did that happen? How did you not catch that 6 or 12 or 18 months sooner? It's because of that dynamic. I'm trusting the experts. I'm outsourcing this. They're telling me everything's fine, so everything must be fine. Or worse yet, things are way off track, but they've got a plan to get it back on track. If they're the same ones that got you off track, the odds of them getting it back on track are slim. So,
yeah, and to me, that's part of the promise of where we can go with this conversation in the next 30 minutes is how we can apply these lessons with better technology to create more transparency across all of these projects, right? Because that's this big thing that we need in this world right now is more transparency into whether it's our supply chains or whether it's our project management. We need to see those things. The technology is there to do it,
Absolutely.
but is the cultural will there to do it? That's what we're going to find out.
Yeah.
All right, are we on number 2 now? What do we got for number 2 in
We're on number 2, and that is failure to see the big picture. So in other words, we get myopically focused on the tech stuff and, building and testing, all the stuff you can see and touch and feel, which is usually the technology, but then missing all the other stuff, the operational implications, the people implications, the organizational design, whether or not this project and what we're building is even aligned with what we're trying to be as an organization. Is it aligned with the culture of the organization? Is it better support our internal employees? Does it better support our customers? Is it making us a better organization? Kind of losing sight of all that stuff in the name of just building some cool new technology. So that's what I mean by failing to see the big picture. That's a big driver for failure.
And just to kind of turn that around, what if you saw a project where there was a tendency to not understand that big picture? How would you sort of address that with a customer? How would you help get them on a better track with that?
Yeah, it's kind of like your question about how do you tell a customer that they're biased without telling them they're biased. It's the same thing here. How do you tell an organization they're screwing up or they're missing a bunch of stuff without just flat out telling them? Sometimes we do. I mean, in this case, I think it is more safe, I guess you'd say, to come out and say, hey, here are some things you haven't thought about. Here are the risks. And I think framing it in the context of risk management is one way to do it. And then the other way to do it is just, again, with the trade-offs. Like, you can keep doing what you're doing. Here's what that's going to look like. Or you could do this, and that's what that's going to look like. It gets back to that parenting love and logic thing I was talking about before. You sort of give them choices and you highlight what the trade-offs are and what the consequences and the upsides are for each of those potential decisions and make it their decision. We always make a recommendation. We think you should do it the right, what we think is the right way, but ultimately it's your call. You're the organization. You've got to live with this. So, we'll support you however we need to.
Thomas says not losing the big picture is important. Still, one needs to be able to take small steps, think big, act small. And actually, Thomas, in the intermission between the countdowns, I want to get into your piece real quick. So be standing by in the comments. Okay, Eric, what's your number 1 way that we can get off track in our digital transformations?
All right. So if you have if you had a professional studio and producers and stuff, they would probably do a drum roll right here. But
let's see. I have an applause meter.
There.
So
it's still premature, but that'll work.
Yeah, I mean, let's see if you lived up to the applause.
I know. No, there's a lot of pressure. This might be a letdown. No, but number 1 is misalignment, and misalignment being, misaligned internally. We're not all on the same page with what we're trying to accomplish, or this transformation, this project is not aligned with what our overall goals and objectives as an organization are. So I'll give you a quick example. Company A is a high growth company. They've gone out and acquired a bunch of other companies. They're PE. They've got PE money. They've acquired a bunch of companies, and now as part of their transformation, they need to figure out, how do we tie this all together? We've got a bunch of pieces we've acquired. We're all acting like 10 different companies. How do we start acting like one company? So standardization, common operating model, that's all important to us. But then you go through your digital transformation and you start taking this agile approach where you don't define your end-to-end processes, you don't define the common operating model, and you just start deploying stuff. And right there, that's misalignment. You're going this way when the organization is trying to go that way. Your transformation's, diverging from that. So that's what I mean by misalignment, is both alignment between the project and the overall organization, and also even just internally agreeing on how much do we want to standardize, what areas do we want to standardize.
Well, that we stopped it. You lost at a good point there, because we're kind of in this transition. And I just posted up Thomas's blog post on the distinctions he made between digitalization, and digital transformation. And I don't want to get too semantical in our discussion today, Eric, but I thought Thomas, who's in the chat today, made some really interesting points. And I'll just read you a couple of things that he kind of goes into. Essentially, that each one of these is a different level of commitment and cultural sort of transformation around change. So he says digitization, the process of converting analog into a computer readable format to improve existing processes. In other words, digitization is about doing things better. And then he talks about digitalization, which he defines as using this technology to create new processes. It's about doing better things. So that's a little bit of a distinction there. Instead of doing things better, doing better things. And then he says digital transformation is about doing entirely different things. And I think and he talks about this organizational transformation across values, culture, mission, and vision using an outside-in view. And in my mind, that's a little bit of an insight on where we get stuck, because we tend to view this more like a tech thing, whereas his point is that the higher level of this is much broader than that. And I had an interesting conversation yesterday with Qualcomm about a bunch of stuff they're going to be showing at the NRF retail show and sort of the future of retail. And I think retailers are a really interesting example of this, Eric, because how can you have a customer driven transformation if you're a retailer, if your store associates are disgruntled, indifferent, poorly trained, unhappy, and exploited? How can that possibly be a good customer experience? And so to me, that really calls into question, what are you doing with your technology, right? Buy online, pick up in store, whatever, seamless. Eventually, we have to interact with people, and you have to start thinking about how your people fit into the picture. And I think some people have kind of said, well, we're just going to automate the hell out of everything, and that's how we're going to solve that problem. But I don't think that works. I think eventually there are people involved in this. You can automate some stuff, but in the end, how you treat your people, how you empower your people, and what kind of roadmap they feel they have for their own growth, I think is integral to all of this. And so to me, that's a real clue as to like how we go wrong with these projects is we don't incorporate all these things. So
yeah, back to that big picture comment. And to Thomas's point too, I think you kind of have to view call it what you want. I mean, let's just call it a transformation, but it's varying degrees of magnitude of change. Are you kind of just making some incremental improvements? Or are you trying to totally transform your business? Or are you somewhere in between? And that's another piece of alignment you need to have as a team. Your executives might be expecting this big, massive quantum leap or a true digital transformation, like Thomas says, but then your project team ends up treating it more like a digitization project versus, something more significant. And that there's misalignment right there. So it's a good point.
So now we're in the uplifting part of our program. We're actually going to talk about like how we change things for the better, how we get more products across the finish line. Although Tracy Webster, you made a great comment earlier about how go live and handshakes and smiles, is not the end of things. And so Eric, let's kick into your countdown on some underrated keys, because I wanted you to push beyond some of the classics of like, oh yeah, of course we have to think about change management and training, and that's all really important, and I don't want to diminish it, but let's hear your top. Let's hear your top 5. Let's start with one of those, with underrated keys to digital transformation success.
Well, first of all, I just have to give you a hard time. It was very difficult for me to do this top 5 without mentioning change management. Now, I tried to be very specific. There are some change management themes, but I appreciate
fair enough.
Because you would already know number 1 would be change management and be sort of a buzzkill.
Of course.
So I think this is good that you forced me out of my box. So number 5 on my list is non-traditional technology. And I know I'm starting off with the stuff that I always say is the least important, but this is important. And what I mean by non-traditional tech is that, back when you and I started our careers, you kind of had this myopic view of transformation or digital projects, which was ERP, big single ERP systems, monolithic ERP. And now it's like you still see a lot of organizations that are trying to repeat that model or that mindset when there's so many other options out there. You don't need to just look at SAP and Oracle and Microsoft, for example. There's plenty of other best of breed options out there. You've got the Workdays of the world, the Salesforces, ServiceNow, some of these niche industry specific or functionally specific providers. And then you also have industry, niche specific solutions as well. And then you've also got like open source software. You've got open architecture, different tools to use. So there's just so many options, which can be overwhelming to organizations that they end up reverting back to what they know best, which is, well, let me just go talk to SAP, Oracle, and Microsoft and see what they can do for me. So I think you have to look outside of the realm of just the normal, big ticket ERP systems or enterprise technologies and really think about all the options you have out there, because there's a ton of them out there. It's pretty exciting.
Luca, who confides that he's sorry for the typos, he's typing from the cell in bed. Luca, glad you have joined, and I hope to see you in here more often. If we're not connected, send me a connection request. And also just to mention, I'm aware that my my time for the show is unfriendly to European audiences, and I'm sorry about that. Some customers have X number of products that do more or less the same things, different technology platforms. And his core point is customers have to watch out for license pitfalls. He uses the example of digital access and SAP and non-SAP integrations, and how Rise with SAP is trying to mitigate and simplify that. And look, on this program, I don't tend to get too far into one vendor or another, but I have done a lot of articles on SAP and Rise on Diginomica. I just did another one on the syntax and ASUG study, which you could do a search for, that gets into a little bit of your topics there. But I think Luca's point still stands very well, as far as that licensing is a major source of friction and also risk management around all of this stuff. And you do need to understand everything around data ownership, right? Which is core to this, right? Who owns the data? Who's paying for the data? Where does the data reside? I just saw this story come up from Australia about how it was like basically saying that using Google Analytics is considered illegal, or I mean, they're still finalizing, but this whole notion of like where your data resides is a really big deal right now. So,
Yeah, very true.
Eric, number 4.
Number 4. You might like this one too, John. This is skepticism. And keep in mind, this is top 5 things that make the underrated keys to success. And skepticism is one. And the reason for that is because we as humans are optimistic. If we're effective leaders, we tend to be even more optimistic. And that optimism creates this set of blinders, and back to that group think and the bias and, all the stuff we just talked about, and the things that cause difficulties in projects. So you sort of have to be, for the North American people listening here, people from North America that remember Debbie Downer from Saturday Night Live, you kind of need to have a little bit of Debbie Downer in you, to where you're sort of like, yeah, things are great, everything's green on the status report, but here are the risks, or here are the challenges we're facing. Not that you want to be negative, but you kind of need that sense of reality, and you need to stay grounded. And
I love it. You need a grouch on your team. This is awesome. Maybe my corporate career prospects are not as terrible as I thought they were earlier in the week when I described myself as unemployable. If you need a grouch on your team, like I might actually have a corporate future, man. But no, I hear what you're saying too, right? Because there's a tendency to want to have this team camaraderie that's all about sort of like almost extravagant feelings of constant buy-in. Whereas to your point, like maybe it makes sense sometimes to pull back and say, hey, why are you a little hesitant here? What, your BS detector is going off. Why is that?
Yeah. And just be critical and challenge the experts and ask lots of questions. It's, and again, you can be optimistic while doing that. I mean, I use the Debbie Downer example, and if you've seen that skit, she's very negative, and she's sort of like a buzzkill. It's just like everyone's having a good time, and then she comes along, and it's like wah wah, and everyone just everyone's sort of down about something that's supposed to be positive. So you don't want that. I'm exaggerating a bit when I say you should be Debbie Downer, but you sort of need to have that mentality of what am I missing here? Everyone's feeling good, everything's perfect, everything's great, everything's awesome. But if that's the case, you're missing something, because there's always I hate to say there's always something wrong, but there's always risk. You should have a pretty robust risk log, and you should have a risk mitigation strategy. And the thing that drives me crazy is when I see a project like in an expert witness case or a lawsuit where the SI has a risk management log, and they've got like 3 risks that are just super generic and no big deal at all. It's like, okay, then something's wrong. Someone's either lying and hiding the truth, or they just don't know what they're doing if they've got 3 really high level, basic, generic risks on their risk log. So I think that's just the reality of these projects. They're hard.
Bonnie Tinner says, Chief Grouch needed on every project. This is awesome. If someone could endorse me for that on my LinkedIn profile, that would really make my weekend.
A whole new advisory services for you could be provided.
Absolutely. There are often political things in play too, says Tracy Webster. If the sponsor at the end of the client is positive, a lot of times everyone will follow their lead.
Awesome point. CIOs are guilty of this. CFOs, the executive sponsor, is most likely to fall in that trap. That's a great point.
Yeah, and Crawford says Oscar the Grouch for CIO, but voices of seasoned experience are often ignored. And it's true, right? I mean, we can't transcend organizational politics, which is kind of what you've covered a lot during this discussion, is that you can't always transcend all of that. But what you can do is at least challenge it and make other options more visible. Oliver Marks, who's a world-class analyst and Grouch on Twitter, his comment didn't show up in the chat, but he says, you can't outsource the strategic spine. There has to be a there. And he says you cover the marketing spin immediately, but there's a naive internal belief in next gen tech being ultra cool in the way forward, amplified by suppliers. So that's a really relevant point there by Oliver, I think.
Yeah. Very
So
good point.
Great conversation here with Eric and Jonathan. We're so excited to hear more. Such great insight. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
But today, if you can't, then it doesn't matter anyway. You will never understand it 'cause it happens.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm Kyler Cheatham. I'm here with Eric Kimberling and Jonathan Reed, and we're talking about some interviews that Eric and Jonathan did together regarding digital transformation failure and just overall bias in the industry. So we're going to jump back into their conversation.
And are we number 3 on your countdown?
Number 3, we can do this real quickly because I've already stole the thunder of this one and alluded to it. But number 3 is challenge the experts. It's your business, and I say this for people that hire Third Stage, hire our company and our team. Challenge us. I mean, it's your business. We'll tell you what we think, but ultimately you decide what you need to do as a business. And there's times where we make recommendations the clients ignore, or they say, yeah, we'll take that into consideration, or we did take it into consideration, but we're doing this and here are the reasons why. And it's not our job to judge or tell them they're right or wrong. We'll tell them what the risks are and we'll advise them and help them through that path. But ultimately you have to own this and challenge those experts, especially when those experts have a lot to lose by not doing it their way. That tells you right there, there's a bias there. There's economic incentive that may not be aligned with your needs.
Absolutely. Okay. Number 2.
Number 2, I don't remember what it is. Oh, and this one I alluded to already too, and that's risk management, risk mitigation, being able to proactively identify a risk before they become felt. So in other words, a lot of times companies will get to testing or training sort of on the tail end of a project, and then all these risks pop up and all these things that they should have known 6, 9, 12 months earlier, they're just now finding out because they're seeing it, materialize. So that risk mitigation and proactively managing risk is very important.
One thing I took away from our conversation too, Eric, and tell me if I got this right. It seems you kind of have the point of view that everything has a sort of a risk management set of trade-offs, that nothing is exempt from that, right? Which I think is a kind of an important point, right? That everything has a set of pros and cons attached to it, which sort of gets to Oliver's point around next gen gee whiz technology, that no matter what it is, whether it's 5G or whatever it is you think is going to solve your woes in some area, like there's always going to be a set of pros and cons, right? And so fleshing those out is a really healthy exercise.
Yeah, and just knowing those risks. It's kind of like going in for open heart surgery. You think, okay, I'm going to go get open heart surgery and everything's going to be fine. Well, you still need to eat well. There's a risk that you could die on the operating table. I mean, that's a real risk, and you've got to be, the healthier you are, the more you take care of yourself, the more likely you are to not have that be a problem. So it's just stuff like that. I mean, you have to think that these, for most organizations, even if it's a quote unquote simple upgrade of technology, it's a massive change. Even the simplest implementations are pretty significant changes. And anytime you go through massive change, that's a big risk to your organization because you're disrupting, whether you like it or not, you're disrupting your day-to-day operations.
Thomas makes a point, very important. Advice solutions need to be explainable. I think that's true. And I think, in the age of so-called AI, that's getting more intense, right? Because now we're getting to this level where some solutions that are being put into place, you're not explaining how you get the results. That's going to be a problem, right? So just because you get recommendations on inventory management from your AI system, you want to know why you're getting them. And that's something that really needs to be conquered in many cases.
Yeah.
So Lucas says his personal tip is to have 3 offerings in order to compare dollars, assessments, and time to go live. I think one of my big things is like, have a dark horse on your short list, like before you just take you start with 20, but your short list always looks the same in the end. It's like,
Right.
keep a dark horse in your short list, keep a real underdog in there. And, Eric, one thing I think is really interesting and that I'm seeing a lot in the cloud SaaS ERP market is a little bit of a shift where some industries that have never really had user-friendly multi-tenant software before, they're bending a little bit on their functionality demands in order to get better software that especially younger people want to use.
Right.
But with the understanding that the vendor is going to continue to much more easily update that software than historically was possible with on-prem, right? So now that changes your shortlist a little bit, right? Because now you might say, hey, let's let this dark horse in that doesn't have all the functionality we need, but we really like how fast they're moving and how mobile and intuitive their software is. So to me, that's part of my recipe for this is like, don't make your shortlist too conventional. Like have something on there that's going to give you some curveballs, even if you don't end up going with it.
Yeah, it's a helpful exercise, even if you don't end up going with it, like you said, because you end up seeing what your options are. You're thinking outside the box. You're looking at those pros and cons and sort of deliberately making those trade-offs. So I think I totally agree with you on that.
All right. Before we get to number 1, let's leave that suspense for a sec. You did another post I really liked towards the end of the year. What is the best digital transformation methodology? Which of course is a little bit of a trick thing, right? Because you're not the kind of person who would say, well, this Lean Six Sigma or whatever. Like you're not going to fall into like one bucket. But I thought it was really interesting. What inspired you to sort of compare and contrast different methodologies?
Well, actually, it was not my idea. I was there's a company we work with that they're actually a VAR, but they refer anytime client needs independent help, they'll refer us to them. And the gentleman that I was talking to was telling me about this client that he's working with, and he used this phrase that really stuck with me. He said it's sort of like the classic clash of the implementation methodologies. And he was talking about how his client was struggling with that. The vendor had one methodology, they had their own PMO, and then the VAR had their own methodology. So they were sort of like trying to reconcile that. And so it just gave me, I just got the idea from him. It wasn't my idea. I'd love to take credit for it, but it was his idea.
So what do you think is the benefit of that? Because I enjoy talking about this because I've come up with like in my little short thinking around it, like different methodologies. Like you can have more of a data and analytics driven transformation. You could have more of a supplier driven transformation. You can have more of a digital core transformation that's centered around your core processes and you're modernizing your ERP. I think there's so many different transformation models. Is that kind of what you were hoping to accomplish in that post, is to try to get people thinking around like different ways to tackle the issue?
Yeah, and really just getting people outside of the one size fits all silver bullet mentality. I think the one that really stands out to me is probably the biggest culprit of creating problems in the industry right now is Agile. You get a lot of Agile evangelists that are just passionate about Agile, and they're all about Agile. You get certified in Agile, and Agile on the surface sounds like a great way to counter those big bloated implementation failures of years past. But now, again, all you've done now is you may be solving one problem, which is now it's not big and bloated, it's not moving quite as slow, but now you're moving fast, which is great. But you're oftentimes moving fast. You're moving faster in the wrong direction. So is that really helping you in the long term? So that, to me, Agile, I don't want to pick on Agile too much, but that's one example. Or you look
go ahead. So sorry, Eric, keep going.
I was just gonna say, or you look at like vendor implementation methodologies who have their sort of prepackaged way of doing things that it just can't work for everyone. One size cannot fit all. So that was really sort of the impetus behind it.
Yeah, and I think one interesting thing on Agile too is you have two other problems. One is that the word Agile is used quite a lot now in contexts that have nothing to do with the structured Agile methodology. And when it comes to the structured Agile methodology, when I talk with real Agile practitioners with a capital A, they often don't have very good answers for me to this day on how to do that across time zones and across international projects. Now, it's not that they have no answers, but Agile was created as a whiteboarding exercise with the team in the same room doing sprints. That's how it was envisioned. So translating that across time zones is
Right.
not a simple thing, actually. So I like what you said.
Yeah.
Nathan Crook, by the way, he likes the dark horse thing. He's made that choice before. Nathan, great to see you in the chat. And Tracy says, "Oh my God, preach! Agile is a theoretical thing. Faster in circles." Yeah. So moving faster in circles, Tracy, probably is not the outcome we're looking for in our projects, but it certainly does make you think you're busy, though, which is like half the battle, I suppose. So listen, we've held off on Eric's number one key, underrated key. So now we're going to do it, Eric. What you got?
All right, we're gonna do it. And again, you wouldn't let me say just change management, so I try to pick something that's change management.
You snuck it in. Okay,
but very specific, guys. So this is change management-ish, but it's very specific, and that is, and I've alluded to this on the previous countdown. That's internal alignment. If all you do on your project is you're aligned, it may not be the best strategy, you may not have the best implementation plan, you may not have the best technology, but if all you have is you're all aligned on what it is you're trying to accomplish, I'll take that bet any day over the one that has a better strategy or a better technology or whatever the case may be. So I think just getting aligned before you start your transformation, before you start implementing stuff, you better be aligned, because that misalignment creates a bunch of friction and headwinds, and it creates a lot of risk, time, and money that most organizations don't have. So give you an example, and I'll pull Accenture, Deloitte back into this. You've got Deloitte in, they've got 50 full-time people on your project, and you're sitting there trying to figure out what we want this project to be and what we want to be when we grow up. Those guys are billing whether you're ready or not, and you're not ready if you're not aligned. And so you're paying these guys by the hour, the meter's running, and so you're ramping up the cost, you're ramping up the risk, and so that whole alignment piece is, in my opinion, the most important underrated key to success.
And Eric, if you began to pick up on, if you were working on a project with Third Stage and you began to pick up on a sense that there was some lack of alignment, as we put it, how would you go about taking that on?
Well, I think, one of the best ways as humans that we can understand and relate to something as vague and nebulous as misalignment is sort of painting a tangible picture of where that misalignment is. So if we can look at operations, operationally, here's where we're misaligned. Stakeholder and organizationally wise, here's where we're misaligned. Executives are saying this, mid-level management thinks this and prioritizes these things. Frontline employees are prioritizing things this way. You sort of have some very tangible, quantitative, specific ways that you're misaligned. It's one thing to use the word, a vague word like misalignment. It's another thing to say, this is exactly what we mean by misalignment and how you're misaligned. It's sort of like change management. Change management is so vague. I think that's probably why, that might be part of why you didn't want me to talk or use that phrase, is because it's such a big bucket of nothing. You got to get down into the pragmatic pieces of that are important.
Yeah, you did a good job of avoiding my ire on that point, and
still keeping it in.
Yeah, I like how you got around my filter a little bit there. And look, like I said, I'm not disagreeing with this change management like being important. It's just like I think Tracy in the chat talked about resistance to change, and Maureen as well, and resistance to change is like a core thing here, right? And how we overcome that is a big part of this. And one of the things I actually like about our current state, I think Oliver is right that we're still in this sort of shiny new toy thing where there's always some new toy. But one thing I do like is that there's a lot more pressure to get users to adopt software now. And so there's a lot less of this phenomenon of like, oh, we sold a bunch of software and we're collecting money on the licenses, but who cares if they're really using it or getting value out of it? They're paying for it. We're good.
Right.
We bundled it with some other stuff that they're using. And now like that lack of adoption is a real vulnerability, right? And so that gets us back to the change thing, right? Because it's like, well, they're not enthusiastically using this software, so that's a failure. Now that's a failure. And so why aren't they enthusiastically using that software? And to me, that's where your blogs come in, is understanding that. And that's why I think it's really worthwhile for folks to engage with your ideas, and why I wanted to have you on the show, because you don't just kind of blog different things at different days. You kind of have this whole view of the enterprise. And so thanks for sharing that with us today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Really enjoyed that. I want to give you a chance to plug your upcoming show. But first, Lucas says, I'd love to see 30 participating in a meeting and only 3 actually work and make the hard decisions. I'm not sure if that was sarcastic or not, Lucas, so I'm going to have to leave you to explain that one. Um, so tell the folks a little bit about Stratosphere, because it is free, right? They can register for it. So just give us a little bit about that show.
Yeah, so it's actually an event we started doing pre-COVID in person. Sort of a 3-day session to kind of dive into all the different people, process, technology components of transformation and implementations. And what we obviously during the pandemic that shifted, and so what we did within 30 days of all the lockdowns happening in March of 2020, we decided, hey, let's move it digitally and start offering it digitally, and let's do it for free. So we just sort of thought outside the box and just decided to offer the whole thing for free to a global audience. And so that's where it sort of all started. And we've done 2 or 3 of them, I think, since the pandemic. And it's a 3-day event. I think it's 6 hours each day. I speak at a few sessions. Our team speaks. We have guest speakers from outside, third stage. So a lot of different viewpoints on, what it takes to make these projects successful. And again, the whole idea is to provide an event where it's not sales spin. It's not rose-colored glasses spin. It's more of a realistic view of this is what you need to be thinking about as you go through a transformation. So it's meant to be educational, engaging, collaborative with people that are joining. We get a lot of good feedback and discussion from the people that join. So I always learn a ton just from the audience. So you learn just as much from the people that are joining the event as the ones that are presenting, in my opinion.
Thank Lucas confirming it was a sarcastic comment about the 3 actually working and making the hard decisions. I figured as much. But yeah, and that's February 8th through 10th. So those of you who want to do that, just check out the Third Stage Consulting site, or just get the homepage. It's right on there, Stratosphere 2022. So I think I might definitely check some of that out. You got me a press pass to one of last year's and really enjoyed some of the conversations, and there were some good customer discussions as well, which was really cool to hear the field lessons, right? Because we can all learn from those if we don't.
Yeah,
never ends.
Absolutely.
So Eric, thanks for exclusively revealing this content and having this awesome discussion. And thanks. This was an awesome chat. You guys really came through today, made it fun. Thanks for joining, Eric. It was a pleasure to have you. I'm sure we'll do it again at some point.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, and thanks for doing the show. It's really entertaining. I always learn a lot, and I always laugh at multiple times. Even when I'm not on your show, I'm always laughing at half the stuff you say. So I really appreciate, because you just have a unique way of delivering some of these messages. So, and you have a good market. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and great questions from the audience too. So appreciate that.
What's funny, because I've been writing about B2B content strategy and how it doesn't have to be entertaining, but I'll admit I do want my show to be entertaining, but not in like a production values way, just in more of like, let's really get to the heart of things together. And and thanks everyone. You guys were just fabulous in the chat today. So you made us all better with your comments.
Excellent dialogue between Jonathan Reed and Eric Kimberling talking about all things digital transformation. We are excited to get back and debrief this with Eric and myself. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for being on the show. If you don't follow his YouTube channel, we highly recommend it. Great partner and overall great industry insight when it comes to the content he produces. So with that, let's jump back in, Eric, and kind of dissect that overall conversation.
Hi, this is Eric Kimberling, the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we recently hosted our Digital Stratosphere 2022 virtual event. It's 3 days of packed content related to digital transformation best practices, about 16 or 18 different workshops and different speakers that are presenting on different topics, everything you need to know about transformation. The bad news is if you miss that event, the event's over. The live event already happened. But the good news, if you've missed it, or even if you did attend it and you want to see replays or you want to catch the sessions you missed, you can do that now by going to stratosphere2022.com. Go to stratosphere2022.com, register. All you have to do is put in your name and email address, just a few fields. You get immediate access to all the recordings, and the recordings cover everything from digital strategy, software selection, organizational change, process improvement, architecture, data migration, cloud, trends in the industry, how to avoid failure, some of the legal aspects to think about, contractual aspects to think about as it relates to your transformation. All that is stuff that you'll get by registering for Stratosphere 2022 replay. And again, go to stratosphere2022.com and you can listen to all the replays of all the workshops that you might have missed at the event. So hope you check it out, and thanks for listening. We'll see you soon.
Relax, don't do it when you wanna go to it. Relax, don't do it when you wanna come. Relax.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 58. My name is Eric. I'm here with Kyler. We just had John Reed interviewing me for his podcast. What were some of your observations of seeing me in the hot seat there, Kyler?
Yeah, my favorite. I love to, put you on the spot and see what great insight we can garner. And I know Jonathan.
You were just disappointed that you weren't the one to do it for once.
I'm just jealous that Jonathan's better at it than But he brings such a great, I think, energy to the overall conversation. And I do think it's important what he was talking about, in why do transformations fail, and understanding that the real key there is the business needs and not letting someone else tell you what your business needs are. So, I sit in the back seat to a lot of client work here. My job at Third Stage is to bring clients to the table and bring our mission and voice to our overall audience. So I don't, engage in a ton of the day-to-day client work. But what I do hear a lot of times is businesses looking to Third Stage to do things like create a business case or to define what their goals should be. And I wonder, as you talked this conversation, how you advise those businesses to really take ownership over their project and explain to them that if they don't, somebody else will, and it won't go well for them.
Yeah, it's a good question, because as you were saying that, I was thinking, well, a lot of people want to hear that there's even an option on the table that they don't have to. And I think the hard part.
And maybe there is. I have no idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is an option. I mean, and a lot of organizations demonstrate that every day. But the problem is, as you allude to, there's an inherent flaw in that model where if you don't own the project, to your point, someone else is going to make decisions for you, and it's a lot like guesswork. You're going to be shooting in the dark and hoping that those people that are filling the void for you outside your organization, people that don't know your organization as well as you do, they don't know your strategy as well as you do. You don't want those people making those decisions for you. But it's hard to explain to organizations and teams and executives what that means. And what it means is you have misalignment between your technology deployment and your overall business strategy. And when you have misalignment, it doesn't matter how great the technology was designed and built and deployed, it's not going to succeed because it's not aligned with who you are as an organization or what you're trying to accomplish. And in the off chance that you just happen to get out of that implementation unscathed and it wasn't a complete unmitigated disaster, then the other even bigger risk is that you're not getting the business value out of the technology. You're not getting what you expected from the technology. So there's really two sort of layers of risk there. And, I'd put the odds at, 90%, 95% plus likelihood of failure if you don't take ownership of the project and you don't, or if you don't avoid that dynamic of just sort of letting someone else take over for you or taking that outsourced mentality that someone else is just going to manage the entire thing for you.
Right. And I like how you and Jonathan often talk about in the industry the quote unquote best practice talk track from vendors of saying like this is a best practice. And a lot of times you have to kind of drill down to, is that actual sales language, or is it a best practice that's most efficient for them, or is it something that you should consider? And it made me think of another client case study we've been working on here at Third Stage. Is a lot of our small to medium-sized businesses, budget is a big thing for them. And sometimes it's hard to identify the value of a third-party consultant, even though we know that that's going to make sure that they have any gaps within their internal knowledge and really an investment to success. It's very similar to change management, right? But it's hard sometimes to quantify. We recently had a client that we took through a selection, and they decided they wanted to do their implementation themselves, which is totally their prerogative. We just give them our best practices and our advice to say, this is the best way to go about that. And then they came back to us a couple weeks later saying, I'm involved with this vendor and I have no idea what they're asking me for when it comes to implementation. And then we, get involved again and get our partners involved as well. And I just wonder, when it comes to looking at those types of objections when thinking about a vendor can come in and kind of swoop down and almost knowledge vomit, if you will, all of these different aspects that maybe a business doesn't understand. How do you go in there and help these organizations see the investment in the opportunity of having someone that kind of speaks their language, so to say?
Yeah, so I think the key is to, first of all, educate your team as early on as possible, so that they can be somewhat at the same level with the outside partners. So that's a role we will play with clients oftentimes, is just making sure that they're not going to become experts overnight in something that they don't do every day, but you can at least educate and get people up to speed and get people aligned on what the project's going to be and what their role is going to be and what they need to know, what skills they need to develop as the implementation's going. If you do that, then suddenly you're in control. Now you are empowered to manage those system integrators and those third-party consultants in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise. So it sort of levels that playing field. So that's probably the biggest thing that we do to help enable that sort of thing.
I almost see it, and this might sound kind of out there, but as like a parent-child relationship. Like, you have this child, which is the organization that's kind of out in this big scary world, and they're being influenced by, things that aren't healthy choices, smoking cigarettes or something like that. And then third stage is the parent comes in and is like, no, that's not something you should do. Stop tobacco companies, type of thing. So it's just an interesting relationship that I feel like John really understands how it can go wrong. And I think that's why this failure piece is really something that if I were an organization going through a digital transformation, I would listen to that recording over and over and over again and just grab all of the key insights just to make sure that you understand what roles a vendor can Jedi mind trick you into doing. And then all of a sudden you're with a software that doesn't work as well. Marcus Harris always says it great. Software works. It's always going to work.
Well, good. Well, that's probably a good place to leave it, and we'll leave it at that. And there's a lot more we could unpack there, but that is a good conversation with John, and he's got some good insights. And again, you can learn more about him and his organization or his publication at diginomica.com, which is spelled digonimca.com. So be sure to check that out. And I agree with you, by the way, listening to that interview, if you're about to go through a transformation, or if you know someone that's about to go through a transformation, or a peer that's going through a project with you, I would be sure to share that interview with them, because I think it's a good conversation especially for those about to start. So I want to thank you, Kyler, for all your help today and for co-hosting as always. And thank you to the audience for being here and for the great questions throughout the discussion here. We put out new episodes every Wednesday on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, as well as all the audio podcast platforms. So be sure to like us, subscribe to us, leave us comments, feedback on the show. We'd love to hear your feedback there. So thanks everyone for being here. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week on Transformation Ground Control.